Hello, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you today to our second annual Campus Climate Core Conference. Right now, I think that we're all very excited to share with you some of this content today, especially as we began last year from a very successful journey. A lot of students participated, a lot of folks from the University of Florida, other universities across the state, really gave us, I think, an inspiration for how we're going to be moving forward from here on out, especially given the fact that right now, more than ever, the need to discuss climate change, the need to discuss some of these extraordinarily important topics. They're more relevant than ever, and they're more important than ever. Even right now, it may seem like it's quite a nihilistic worldview. With every passing moment, it seems like we're losing momentum. With every passing moment, it seems like we're losing track and focus. We're losing the potential, the opportunity. Most importantly, we're losing time. But that just means that there is no more important point in our history at our time than now to begin. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you today to one of our first speakers, Dr. John Capece. Dr. Capece was trained as an agricultural engineer and hydrologist at the University of Florida, where he earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate, and also served as faculty. Dr. Capece now also serves as Kissimmee Waterkeeper, a group he established in 2020 after 25 years of helping lead Caloosahatchee River Watch, which is now named Colusa Waterkeeper. Dr. Capece also served as the state science officer for the Democratic Environmental Caucus of Florida and advised candidates in developing their environmental and climate policies. So it is my privilege as MC of today's Campus Climate Core event to share with you our next speaker. So Dr. John Capece, take it away.
Thank you, Rock, and we all miss you here. Welcome everyone from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Rock normally takes these trips with us. He's been on every one of these UN climate conferences since 2015 Paris, but this year he was unable to make it, but he's anchoring the operations from there in Gainesville, Florida. So we thank him and miss him. So welcome everyone. We are in Sharm el-Sheikh. This is a interesting location for the UN Climate Conference. It's an exotic location. It has its own set of unique challenges, and you'll hear more of those in the coming days and couple of weeks. It also has its unique advantages. Very picturesque place with many things to keep us distracted from our tasks, but we will stay focused. We will not let this place distract us from our mission. We will deliver the information from the UN Climate Conference. So I'd like to share some slides here with you. All right, are we able to see these slides? Very good.
Yep, John.
Well, apparently not. There we go. So Campus Climate Core is a program of other organizations. Campus Climate Core is not its own separate incorporated group. It is a program of two other organizations. And here we are in Sharm el-Sheikh, just to give you a little orientation to the geography. We are nearer to Israel and Jordan. We are right across the straits from Saudi Arabia, and nearer to Israel and Jordan than we are to Cairo in Egypt, where vast population center. So it's a small community, a tourist town, separated from the rest of Egypt by the expansive Sinai Peninsula, and it looks like quite formidable geography from where we sit looking on the horizon at some quite impressive mountains. So Campus Climate Core is a program of two organizations, Intelligentsia International. And Intelligentsia is actually a spin-off organization from the National Association of Graduate Professional Students. Back in '89 through '91, we conducted some international exchange projects with the Soviet Union and people from the People's Republic of China, both pro-democracy organizations from those places. A lot has happened in the decades since, but the organization continues on picking its missions as we find the challenges before us. So Intelligentsia has hosted 500 students from 400 nations over the years, beginning in 1999 when I left the University of Florida. In 2015, we hosted about 25 students from France in preparation for the UN Climate Conference held in Paris. And these students helped prepare Campus Climate Corps expansive exhibit, as well as the program for the students attending the UN conference. The French students hosted a very large conference of youth attended by thousands of students with huge exhibit areas and workshops. Very good experience. The other organization that leads Campus Climate Corps is called Alpha Epsilon Lambda, and that is the National Honor Society of Graduate Professional Students. It has chapters around the country or forming. Brock is a member of the Alpha chapter at the University of Florida. Now, as I mentioned, both Alpha Epsilon Lambda and Intelligentsia International are spin-offs of the National Association of Graduate Professional Students. Now, the NAGPS is an umbrella organization and is composed of campus members from around the nation. And at University of Florida, the members have traditionally been the Graduate Student Council and the Graduate Assistants United. Over the years, the membership has evolved. Graduate Student Council is now the lead organization for NAGPS at the University of Florida. Now, Rock is an officer of NAGPS this year. He serves as the Director of Legislative Affairs nationally. And here in this image, you see another one of our upcoming speakers on the left, Cooper, who will be talking to us from California, where he helps lead graduate student organizations. Earlier this year, in April, Rock and I organized participation for graduate student leaders in a hearing of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, chaired by Representative Castor of Florida. That was a unique experience. Rock was helping organize the legislative action days for the National Association of Graduate Professional Students and incorporate this as one of the activities for the organization during that trip to Washington. So, student organizations are very important in addressing the issue of climate change. The more senior of us embedded in the economy and professional circles having a very difficult time getting action from our governments, from our corporations, from all of our institutions. And it's very clear that it's going to require the young people to step forward and achieve any transformation in our society. But the question remains, can we as a society, as a civilization, act in time to head off climate crisis, which is upon us and fast approaching catastrophic level? Another important question is, how did we get here? What set of circumstances resulted in this current crisis and our inability to properly confront it? By understanding how we got here, we're in a better position to chart a more successful path forward. So it's important that students understand how we got here, as well as what the nature of the problem is. Now, when we talk about how we got here, it's basically academic exercise in greenhouse gas accounting. And when you do this accounting, you see very clearly that the nations that have gotten us to this point are the United States and Europe, largely together in parallel, but also China, and China is fast rising as far as its cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at by 2030, this graphic shows that the US, Europe, and China will have parity amongst themselves in their cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So by 2030, by any measure, these three entities are largely responsible for the climate crisis. And what are we doing about it? If the United States is the leading nation in having generated greenhouse gases that are driving climate change, it is logical that the United States help lead the world out of this crisis. And it must do that by investing its wealth and the talents of its people in the set of solutions that are required to reverse the situation, or at least deal with the situation. Now, the last time the United States was confronted with an existential threat was basically World War II. And in that war, we ramped up our economy and basically dedicated a third of our entire GDP to the war effort. Now, if you translate that into modern sense, into the current economy, 35% of the US GDP translates to approximately $7 trillion per year. So, are we on track for treating the climate crisis as we would a serious world war? And the answer is clearly no. If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, the most recent legislation to invest in climate solutions, we see that it invests approximately $38 billion per year in climate solutions. Of course, this isn't the totality of US investment in climate solutions, but it is a major element. This translates to 0.5% of the US GDP. So $38 billion per year versus $7 trillion per year. We are in no way approaching the level of commitment required to take on this challenge. And if we look at the implications of climate change in our area, my area, where I live, we just experienced Hurricane Thiele, which devastated the southwest coast of Florida, destroying many, many homes. Vehicles, they're still trucking vehicles out of the area. And the estimated cumulative damage from Hurricane is $70 billion. That's almost twice the annual investment provided by the Inflation Reduction Act. So not only are we not investing enough, we're very quickly falling behind in spending our limited wealth on fortification and recovery from climate-related events. And this will sap our ability to work on actual solutions. So it's critical that we make the investments now for the costs to dominate all of our budgets. Now, when we look at not just the US, but the global GDP, approximately 80% of the global GDP is accounted for by approximately 10 nations. So these 10 nations are obviously those that should step forward and lead in tackling this issue. The United States, China, Japan, Germany, South Korea, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Canada, Australia. Many other countries can contribute, will contribute in meaningful ways, but these nations must lead. And how can they lead? Well, we must reduce greenhouse gases. To reduce greenhouse gases, we have to ramp up new technologies. And one of the most important technologies is solar photovoltaics. Now, I'm using this as simply an example of new technology and the time required for new technology to deliver meaningful solutions to contribute to mitigating the climate crisis. As you can see here, back in 95, actually all the way to 2005, the electric capacity, production capacity of solar was insignificant. Only in 2010 did it begin to ramp up. And now you can see it's following an exponential growth curve. So even though we knew back in the 90s that photovoltaics was a critical solution, that it took us a long time to ramp up production. Now there's another curve that's important, and that's the curve on the net benefits from solar photovoltaics or any new technology that seeks to reduce greenhouse gases. And this measure is called energy payback break-even time. So back in the 90s, the amount of time you would have to operate a solar panel to offset the amount of energy that went into creating that solar panel was approximately 10 years. That time has been driven down to less than a year using the most cutting edge technology. However, the global production of photovoltaics does not always, well, it never represents the cutting edge technology. It's always a combination of existing infrastructure, manufacturing facilities created years or decades ago, along with more modern facilities. So the aggregate break-even time gradually goes down. So the combination of the deployment curve, the exponential growth curve, and then this reduction curve in the energy payback break-even time combined in a standard engineering computational spreadsheet to deliver curves that look something like this. So depending on how rapidly you drive down the energy required to produce solar photovoltaics determines at what point in time you will actually begin to deliver net benefits. In other words, the energy delivered by photovoltaics yielding an actual greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So as we see here in this graph, that could be anywhere from 2013 to 2022 to 2025. Some additional computations we made suggest that the break-even time might be anywhere from 2023 to 2027. So a technology developed long ago, but taken seriously in the 90s and 2000s, still takes basically 30 years before it matures to the point where it will deliver actual greenhouse gas reductions. So it's important that young people demand that our society, that our economy, that our government begin action on a wide range of technologies so that they can deliver results in time to gain benefit to the world. Now, this also requires disposing of old technology. Old factories can continue to operate, but we can't afford to continue to allow them to operate because of their carbon emissions. So we're going to have to retire infrastructure early in this country, in this world, and that's going to be a hard economic choice to make. Now, we may be talking about some of the technical aspects, but solving climate change problems requires contributions from all disciplines. Therefore, all students have a role to play in this. Technology has never been the limiting factor in solving climate issues. It's always been economics and social factors. So obviously, the students operating in those disciplines have an important role to play, if not a dominant. Now, Campus Climate Corps envisions this event evolving into a broader event at many campuses, where we address both the social and the technical factors that contribute to the climate crisis and its set of solutions. So while this event and the coming 14 days of hour-long briefings will address a range of issues that are being discussed here at the climate conference, we're also looking towards the materials content for conferences throughout the nation. Now, we're also sensitive to the factors of our own carbon footprint in taking these trips to the climate conference. That is why our primary function here is to deliver the content to many more people throughout the United States, throughout the world. By leveraging the virtual technologies, we can offset the overall impact of our travel. And we've demonstrated that through basic analysis that you can, by delivering content virtually, you can save 95+% of the greenhouse gas impacts associated with travel. So it's a very important capacity to develop and environment, an educational environment that people must adapt themselves to begin to fully exploit. Now, we're also here with the Collier County Waterkeeper, Casey Schulberg, and he produces, along with myself, a series of briefings from the COP designed for the waterkeepers route. So if you're interested more in water issues, you can tune in to these as well, and you'll find those on the City Waterkeeper Facebook page or the Collier County Waterkeeper Facebook page. So, university students, you have a major role to play in this crisis in generating the solutions, and looking forward to hearing from the students who are with us and faculty as well. So thank you, Robert.
And thank you very much, John. Great presentation as always. Okay, so now we'll dive into a little bit about COP. Let's have the presentation up. Okay. So, first of all, for any of you who are watching, I forgot to mention earlier, but we have, no matter what platform you're on, we currently have a live CCC volunteer monitoring all the chats. So if you do have questions, comments, concerns, please submit them in those chats, and our volunteer will relay them to me, where I will go ahead and ask that of the speaker themselves. Most of our speakers today are leaving a little bit of time for Q&A, so please feel free to add them in the chat. You're more than welcome to ask those questions, and we will be watching. And like I said, we'll relay them to the speaker themselves. So as you know, we have a full schedule today. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about COY and COP and what's really the big deal about this massive United Nations summit, right? Last year, of course, there was COP26 held in Glasgow. Some reported big successes, some reported big failures. Most can agree that it was a resounding failure, however, in terms of what it was meant to accomplish, or the goals that it set out to accomplish, and how those goals weren't really fulfilled. Those goals really weren't held to despite the fact that the structure itself was sound. The nations that show up and the delegates that show up really didn't complete the mission that they were assigned to do. So let's talk about moving into COP27 from the perspective of COP26. What were the successes and failures of COP26, and moving into COP27, can we expect any better? So the organization which lords over, or the organization which creates the COP events, is called the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was created in 1992 with the express mandate to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In other words, this is meant to be the penultimate summit, or the penultimate organization meant to deal with the climate crisis. And COP, or the Conference of Parties, is meant to be the organization which is essentially the conference of the UNFCCC. So we'll talk a bit more about the main parties and what usually takes place during a COP. As I mentioned, the COP is called the Conference of Parties, parties being all of the nations, all the delegates, all of the 501c3 non-governmental organizations that attend these events, as well as any other interested parties that the United Nations sees fit to approve as delegates to attend the COP event. Usually these delegates are folks who have some kind of vested interest, either technologically wise, representing a certain group of people, a certain country, a certain interest group, etc. Usually at these events, there are negotiations which take place between NGOs, between governments, between developing and developed nations. There's usually an insane amount of activism that takes place. I think Madrid in 2019 sets the record for the largest climate strike ever to take place. One of the largest gatherings of humans to take place all over the globe. And then Glasgow last year, if you counted all of the folks protesting in every single nation all over the world, it was the largest global protest that has ever been seen. At 2015 in Paris, as many of you might know, we signed the quote-unquote Paris Climate Accords, which were supposed to be the penultimate document, the penultimate agreement about what was to be done about the climate crisis. Every nation, including in nations like North Korea, everybody attended this event and everybody agreed we must do something about climate change. We must limit greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it was lauded by most countries and most organizations and almost everybody at the time as an amazing success. It was meant to be the ultimate success, which saves the planet. Folks were gathering together, folks were taking pictures, folks were, showcasing just what a wonderful and amazing event this was. This was supposed to be what solved the climate crisis. Looking at this event almost 7 years in the future, and we see that it is a resounding failure. The New York Times posted an article last week, and then I think Huffington Post posted an article today, which confirmed we will be blowing past 1.5 degrees Celsius. That would put the Paris Climate Accord to shame. It's not like we didn't know this years ago, that after 2015 and 2016, the next COP, that we weren't upholding the agreements 1 year later, what should really tick us off, that we weren't going to do it 7 years later. But I think we can really see now that 1.5 is lost. And now the resulting COPs moving in from 26 to 27, the discussion needs to be what hardline focal points can we be focusing on to truly limit, whatever we are going to be blowing past. And this is all despite the fact that registered participation for these COP events has skyrocketed. We went from having 5,000 almost 1,000 delegates in 1996 to having almost 20,000 delegates last year in Glasgow. So more people than ever are attending these COP events, and yet the goals are not being followed through. They're not being followed through at all. So let's talk about more in detail about what goes on during COP. Usually week one deals with the World Leaders Summit, the opening bodies and the technical work. World Leaders Summit is typically where the Joe Bidens, the Vladimir Putins, all the big shot leaders come and they give their big speeches. They pat themselves in the back about everything they're doing to solve climate change. They entertain themselves, with fancy get-togethers and stuff like that. Unfortunately, not much gets done during those first few days. The opening bodies and technical work, though, are where the actual delegates, the folks who are number crunching, and folks like that actually get together and start to propose documents, put together proposals, and begin the discussions for how we're going to have developing and developed nations work together to solve the climate crisis. Week two, where the political issues, internation discussions, and last-minute deals take place. Last year, we had a pretty big discussion between Egypt and Sudan and Kenya about the damming of the Nile River. So issues that even are sometimes tangent to climate change are discussed at these events as well. Internation, discussions and last minute deals. So everybody typically waits to the last moment to start agreeing on anything at all. And finally, at the very last minute, do folks typically begin their agreements with each other about what they're going to do. Typically, those take the form of what we call NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. And this is where most of the criticism of COP really comes into effect. Nationally determined contributions are exactly as they sound. They are nations agreeing to what their own perspective, or agreeing to what they're going to do. It's essentially the United Nations saying, we can't force you to do anything, but if you can come up with a plan for how you're going to solve your problems, that would be better for us. So the United Nations has no real power to force nations to agree on anything. So the United Nations leaves it up to each of these individual nations to allocate, their own goals, to allocate their own contributions. And this is truly a bottom-up approach where nations define themselves what they're going to accomplish. But as you can see as the graph on the right, that's not working out too well. In 2015, which is essentially right here, if you can see my mouse, we had an opportunity to start going downwards. And we would have needed to start curbing emissions at that exact moment if we were going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, as the graph continues moving forward, and even as the time where we're, with these nationally determined contributions, we seem to be only petering out, almost like a plateau of sorts. That's not good enough. That's not even enough to reach 2 degrees Celsius. This bottom-up approach, this NDC approach, is the fatal flaw of these COP events. And by leaving it up to the delegates of these nations to determine their own destinies and their own futures, we're really leaving it to the destruction. We're really leaving kicking that can down the road to our own destruction and our own failures. Stronger NDCs, though, are being proposed by different nations this year, among them Argentina, Morocco, Costa Rica, the UK, and the USA. They're proposing that we do strengthen our own NDCs, but notably among the nations which are not proposing to increase their ambitions, the Russian Federation, Mexico, Brazil, and Australia. Although Brazil did recently have an election this year, so we're not sure where they're going to land on these NDCs. But under their previous president, Bolsonaro, especially with the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and the conversion of the Amazon rainforest into a carbon sink, we really are losing that battle in a very fatal way. So we are looking forward to seeing what Brazil comes around. But unfortunately, the Russian Federation, among others, another big contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, that are not strengthening their NDCs. And this is where it leads into the discussion of youth action. And what alternatively happens at COP are the opportunities for the youth to get out there and march. So let me skip forward to a few slides. This is where the real protests begin to happen. This is where the youth get out there and they begin demanding changes to their future. It's where we get the inspiration to do what we're doing right now. This is the time for the youth to strike. Going back to this slide, as you can see, since the Kyoto Protocol, emissions have gone up and skyrocketed in many countries: U.S., Russia, China, especially India, Germany, and other countries, also notably. Last year, in COP26, they came together on the first Tuesday of the event and said, let's agree to deforestation by 2030. The biggest question, though, is what kind of forests will be left by 2030 to chop down? How many forests or how many trees will be left standing by the time that year comes around? So it's again, the issue of nationally determined contributions or nations determining what they're going to do does not set in stone what actions need to be taken from now until then to make this happen. Cutting methane emissions by 2030, same issue. Each year, the big delegates come together and take place. And one of those big, large groups at COP26, the largest group was actually the fossil fuel delegation in COP26. The largest group in attendance at COP26, let that sink in, was the fossil fuel companies. And this is where the legitimacy of COP26 was really called into question. Negotiation rooms were closed off in access in the second week. Usually NGOs who are comprised mainly of scientists and activists are usually allowed in the negotiation rooms to offer criticism, to offer some sort of alternative suggestions, amendments to these agreements. Unfortunately, that didn't happen last year because at the second week, they closed off negotiation rooms only to delegates, and interestingly enough, to a few fossil fuel industry delegates. So we can really see where these COP events are truly heading with that information. The Bolivian chief negotiator called the entire system into question when there was very few discussions on climate financing and climate compensation, especially for developing nations. From the side of developed nations, there was active shutting down of discussions regarding climate compensation from first, developed to developing nations. The big folks also got up there on stage talking about, expressing their record, how amazing they did their job. Obama was up there talking about putting the Paris Climate Accord together, said a few nasty words about Trump, and then Greta came and said some nasty words about Obama. Blah, blah, blah. You can shove your climate crisis up your arse. And that very same day, the most massive, or the largest climate protests in the world were held on that very Friday. I think we got a few photos. It was just spectacular and astounding, the climate marches that we witnessed on those Fridays when we attended the event. According to CNN, though, moving back to some of the issues of COP and why those protests were taking place, pledges to cut methane, coal, and protect forests made at COP will reduce global warming by just a few tenths of a degree, with temperatures on course to be at least 2.4 degrees Celsius higher by 2100. And unfortunately, even CNN's calculations are incorrect, mainly because there is a lack of an international carbon accounting standard. There is truly no way for the entire world to agree on a standard for counting carbon. So is really any country's reported carbon emissions truly accurate is the biggest question that we have. And I think that we can honestly agree that nations who do not have a successful carbon accounting program would probably be skewing some of their results in their favor. So whatever nations are reporting I personally do not believe them to be true. Many scientists do not believe them to be true. They're not reporting accurate information, and especially if they do not have a carbon accounting program to keep them to keep them true. A few other photos that were taken at the event. One photo that we always like to showcase is the study hard, protest harder. We at CCC do believe that it is the job of students to get out there and protest, to get out there and work very hard in our studies. But it's also very important to get out there and protest. If we're not out there protesting, no one's going to do it for us. And that's where I'll leave off today's presentation. A few other interesting photos. I'll leave off today with my presentation on this image, which I always like to leave off of. There are different futures that lie ahead. They're all going to be determinant on what you do, on what every student does. Because this COP event, as big and as loud as it likes to be, does not represent your future and your voice if you're not out there adding your voice to it. And this is where we come in. I expect that our students, especially those at the University of Florida, to tune into our discussions and our briefings over the next 14 days, because this is where you will get your voice added to this discussion, because you're not going to get it added by any other delegates. There's no other world leaders who are out there really representing your interests, but we're going to be out there doing that for you. And we're going to do the best job that we can. So thank you to our team on the ground in Egypt right now. We're going to be doing that. And I will now introduce our next speaker, Valholly. Okay, so Valholly is a member of the Seminole tribe of Florida, Valholly Frank, and she's currently an undergraduate student at the Broward College. Interestingly enough, Valholly right now is currently in Egypt along with our other student, Esteban. So Valholly, welcome. The stage is all yours.
Hi, thank you. And good afternoon to everyone in the States. Hope it's all right over there. Thank you for attending. I'm just going to give a little bit of information about COY, and a little bit of history about it, and what it was like this year. So this is the 17th Annual Conference of Youth. It started in 2005, right before COP27, to make youth voices heard. The UNFCCC Secretariat and the member states officially recognized youth as an observer constituency. Previously, before COY was founded, the youth were known as the International Youth Climate Movement. And of course now, the components of COY are capacity building, policy training, skill building workshops, and cultural exchange. And I was lucky enough to attend COP15 in Madrid a few years back, as well as COP25. And I recently just attended COP27. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what you might expect from it versus what you get. So from all of the description of it, it seems like the most important organization for youth, especially to have our voices heard and to actually make change at this supposedly very monumental climate conference. But attending it, it's not as organized as I would like. Personally, there was just a lot of self-congratulatory and almost celebratory feel to it. Lots of music everywhere. There was no silence whatsoever. And there was just not a lot of preparation that went into it. But one of the main disappointing factors for me was the lack of translators and subtitles of the presentations I went to. Only one of them did have subtitles. And I expect a lot more from the youth, especially when it comes to the language they used, as there was a lot of binary language. And the actual location of the event, it was set in a gymnasium type of place, and it just had very bad acoustics. And even if you are able to hear and you don't need a sign language interpreter, it was difficult to hear. And there were no translations for other languages. It was entirely in English. And there were just a few, it really showed that there was no major preparation that went into it, based on like the last minute cancellations and running out of food or just leaving the water in the sun all day. But what was mainly disappointing for me was going to a lot of the presentations and panel discussions and hearing that they were all very surface level. I really expected some more presentations that required critical thinking and allowed for more intense thoughts than just the typical stuff that climate activists hear. And I'm sure if people have been involved with climate for a while, you know all the classic trigger words and you know all the classic stuff we've all heard it a million times, like, oh, the youth are the future and you guys are doing so great and you guys have got it, wonderful job. The opening ceremony was filled with representatives and older people who were praising the work that was being done and just using that very basic language you see in a lot of climate activities. And it was definitely disappointing, especially because this is supposed to be a place for youth to formally have their voices heard and make an actual change. And that was even recognized at COY, which is a big reason I wish there was more to it. There were a few educational presentations, and the one thing is it is very great for making connections, especially as a younger person going into COP. It can be intimidating, and to be around all of these very professional people, having connections there is wildly comforting. But the entire conference was not as professional as I would have liked to see it, especially compared to how professional COP is. And just in general, there were a lot of attempts to like get the energy up, and it felt like a lot of local protests, when there's that yearning to get everybody excited and happy and joyous. And that can be appropriate in some settings, but I believe in this setting, especially with what is trying to be done, it's just not as professional as it should have been. And I can only hope that it will get better. But from connecting with people there and from attending previous conferences, it really doesn't show any signs of improving, just of staying as this thing that says that youth are being heard, but not much is actually being done. So I hope the COP isn't as disappointing. And that was just my idea of COY and what was going on there. And yeah, while there were a few exceptional presentations and there were things to learn, overall, it is not what I would have expected and not what I wanted to get out of such an important conference, especially for the youth.
I have a question, actually. Holly, explain your background.
My bad. Yeah. My background might explain a little bit more of my cynicism towards this, because I've been involved with activism for many years of my life, basically since I was in the womb. But a few years back, I was a part of a lawsuit called Reynolds versus the state of Florida. And I, along with 7 other youth plaintiffs, sued the state of Florida and the departments, claiming that our constitutional rights were being violated by Florida's continued support of fossil fuels and non-renewable energy sources. And in this case, we used our constitutional rights and also the public trust doctrine to try and prove that climate change is in fact harming us, and the actions that the government was taking is harming us and will harm future generations. Sadly, the case was dismissed, and the court closed the doors on us and never even gave us a written decision as to why we don't have this access to the judicial branch. But after the case was dismissed, the other plaintiffs and I filed a petition for rulemaking with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And it was signed along with 200 other Florida youth. And it was to set a goal of reaching 100% renewable energy by 2050. And Nikki Fried actually did grant the petition. So now it is up to the Public Service Commission to ensure that the Florida utilities meet those goals. So yeah, I've just had many years of experience with political figures and a lot of legal systems, and I know how difficult it is to make change, especially as a young person. Like when a judge told us we can just wait until we're old enough to vote. So
I imagine it didn't fly over too well, huh? I do have a question from Rhonda Ruff. I wonder who that is. Did COY have workshops for sending messages to COP?
It did have a few workshops, but overall, a lot of the workshops that were there and a lot of the presentations were more about, there were actually a lot of workshops about adaptation rather than mitigation. And so many were just about like, they were very surface level. Like I attended a few that were about women's rights and reproductive rights. And it was just very basic talk and discussion about how gender-based violence is affecting women and how it relates to climate change. And it wasn't until the public comments started that there were actually interesting ideas brought up, which proved to me that the people attending this conference are just as eager for change as I am. And the person who attended this conference with me the first day, when the opening ceremony was happening, we were both looking around and saw how disinterested nearly everyone was during the band playing and a singer coming up, and during the opening statements in general. There were a few workshops about policymaking, but all of it was, if I'm maybe honest, it was just a little annoying to sit in on and hear, because nothing new was being said unless there was like an actual expert in their field giving a presentation, which was disappointing.
Fair enough, fair enough. I completely understand that, having attended a few of the COYs myself. It seems like nothing changed at all on that front. However, our next speaker may have something to say about that, actually. So thank you so much, Valholly. Really appreciate, your explanation of COY, the Conference of Youth that works just prior to COP. I do have the honor to introduce our next speaker today, Dr. Stephen Mulkey. Dr. Mulkey is an environmental scientist dedicated to developing undergraduate and graduate programming to build society's capacity for environmental mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Dr. Mulkey was president of the Unity College in Unity, Maine from 2011 to 2015. His leadership and forward-looking vision resulted in Unity College being the first college in the U.S. to divest its endowment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies, and the first college in the U.S. to adopt sustainability science as the framework for all academic programming. Dr. Mulkey believes that the higher education has an ethical duty to prepare generations of graduates for the extreme sustainability and climate change challenges of this century. During and after earning his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, he spent over 20 years as a tropical forest ecologist affiliated with the Smithsonian. Dr. Mulkey has served as tenured faculty at 3 doctoral granting universities, as science advisor to the state of Florida, and as program officer at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Mulkey, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Rock. I'm going to jump right into some slides. Should I share my screen?
Absolutely. You should have that capability.
Okay. All right. So I guess everybody see my screen at this point?
Yep. Good to go.
Great. What we're really talking about is a climate endgame. It's not the end game in an absolute sense, but boy, we're getting close. We're looking at some very dangerous propositions in terms of how climate change will change. I agree with Valholly, and I totally agree with Rock. We're out of time, we're out of excuses. And if you're not frustrated, you're not paying attention. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. I'm angry. The jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. The report is a litany of broken climate promises. It is a file of shame, cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world. And as you can see from this, the Keeling curve on the right, the COPs have made utterly no difference. In June, we passed 420 parts per million. We're back down to 416 right now because the green stuff over the summer in the temperate zone has pulled down a lot of the CO2, but we'll get back above 420 very shortly. So mitigation and adaptation on a global scale must be the primary work of humanity. I'm amazed at the number of people just don't get what that really means. And failure to stabilize the Earth system and its 4 or 5 components will massively cripple or end civilization. The AR6, I just want to talk about some of the results there to set the stage. Extremes will become more extremes. They looked at temperature, drought, precipitation, snow cover, tropical cyclones, and dozens of more parameters at 1.5, 2 degrees C warming, and 4. We can talk about 2 if you want, or even 3, which will be catastrophic. But if we approach 4, civilization ends. There's no way to mince words on that. The data that I've seen say that we could support at most maybe 500 million human beings if we breach 4 degrees Celsius. Drought and flood are becoming the watchword of the day. Every time you look at the news, you see another drought or another flood. And this is because warm air can hold more moisture than cool air. For every degree Celsius increase in global average temperature relative to pre-industrial, the atmosphere can hold on average 7% more water vapor. That means once it gets that water vapor, it has to go someplace. And it typically comes down in downpours, but it can suck more water out of the soil. Large increases in flood and drought risk are projected toward the end of this century. I mean, huge increases. We're already seeing them. Analysis in this particular paper by Tabari et al. Uses medium emission scenarios that are consistent with the current policies and pledges. Soil moisture is the most important factor for agriculture and for ecosystems. The part that worries me the most is all of the huge carbon stores in the Amazon basin. As we warm the planet, the basin is going to lose a lot of that carbon. It's going to dry out and it's going to shift to a new regime. If you look at the breadbasket in North America and the Great Plains state, it too was projected to dry out. We can have a series of degraded ecosystems if we want. I personally don't want to go there. We're talking about a planet that I did not grow up on. I'm 69 years old, pushing 70. And I was born in 1953. I have seen so many ecosystems rather, that have been degraded, not only by climate change, but by human depredation. Healthy ecosystems and biodiversity benefits are obvious. Many of you have already talked about, been taught these in various parts of your education. The bottom line is we need to make this as important an effort as we do killing fossil fuels. So we need to manage the living portion of this planet, both the oceans and the land. The lead author of Working Group 2 of the AR6 said the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Those are tough words, and they're also very accurate. Winning slowly is the same as losing. Every small increase in warming will result in escalating losses and damages across many systems. Up to 3 billion people are projected to experience chronic water shortage due to droughts at 2 degrees of warming, and up to 4 billion at 4 degrees C, mostly across the subtropics and mid-latitudes. By 2030, about 250 million people may experience high water stress in Africa, with up to 700 million people displaced as a result. That comes from Chapter 9 of Working Group 2. Projected flood damages may be up to 2 times higher at 2 degrees C warming and up to 3.9 times higher at 3 degrees when compared with damages of 1.5. Up to 18% of all those species assessed on land will be at high risk of extinction if the world warms 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. At 4 degrees, it'll be roughly 50%. Populations exposed to extreme heat are going to transform humanity. We can see that we are an urban species now, and we're growing as an urban species, especially in Asia and Africa. If you look at the days per year when air temperature and humidity conditions pose a risk, the current historical period, most of those warm periods are near the equator, but as you look at the same region at 2 degrees Celsius, parts of the equator become unlivable, and certainly not any place that you can work outdoors. Primary vector-borne diseases will expand, urbanization plus global warming. We're going to see more Chagas, more malaria, dengue, Zika, Lyme disease, leishmaniasis. Global food supply is already at extreme risk. If you've been shopping recently, you know how high the food prices are, and that's not entirely because of supply chain difficulties and the war in Ukraine. Drought-related and other climate-related factors have been on the increase as you move from 1970 up to 2013. Even warming at 1.6 degrees C will see 8% of today's farmland become climatically unsuitable by 2100. Multiple simultaneous breadbaskets around the world have failed. This has already occurred, and this trend will worsen. We're seeing compounding and cascading impacts from climatic events. Temperatures will exceed 1.5 degrees by 2030. We need to acknowledge that and simply be honest. We're going to blow by that. We will be extremely hard pressed to stay below 2. Cascading and compounding events are appearing faster and more severe sooner than predicted. We have all the technical and policy solutions we need to transition away from fossil fuels. We must move quickly. We need to preserve 50% of the terrestrial biosphere to manage positive feedbacks from those ecosystems that actually warm the climate more. So managing the living portion of the planet is crucial. The global south has been proportionally left out of adaptation resources, yet there's been no interruption of accelerating fossil fuel extraction in the developing south. Various efforts that lock in infrastructure are identified by Working Group 2 as maladaptation. For example, Miami, seawalls and pumps. You cannot build a seawall on a rock base that is basically old beach and limestone. It's porous. Impacts on global health are severe and interacting to produce compounded effects. Return to status quo after a disaster is clearly maladaptive. We've got to stop looking in the rearview mirror. Only large-scale transformation of civilization will suffice. You can see on the right various tipping points around the world. I draw your attention to the ones at less than 2 degrees Celsius. These are the ones that we're really in danger of traversing. And this represents a regime change where return to the previous state will be impossible within any meaningful human time frame. Working Group 3, mitigation and the urgency of massive rapid transformation. To stay below 2 degrees C means deep economic and structural changes. Emissions must peak and begin to fall by 2025 to achieve 1.5, ain't gonna happen. Emissions must be cut by 50% by 2030 relative to 2005 to stay below 1.5. Similarly, very dubious proposition. This means rapid, massive transformation of society, economics, and energy sources. Antonio Guterres says it very clearly. I've seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this, and I second that. I've been doing this gig for about 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what Working Group 3 produced. It's an atlas of human suffering and damning indictment of failed climate leadership. This abdication of leadership is criminal. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our only home. The most important statements from Working Group 3, this is the one that really stands out, and they say it repeatedly. Incremental change is unacceptable. Only wholesale societal transformation will salvage a livable planet. If we come out of COP27 without huge ambition, without something way beyond incremental change, then COP27 has been a failure. These are the carbon bombs by fossil fuel companies and their allies and by petrostates in progress or planned. And you can see that in the dark colors, these are the producing oil and gas and producing coal facilities. In the lighter colors are what are planned during this first half of this century. And then you can see on the right, the 1.5 degrees Celsius budget. We've already blown 420 gigatons of CO2 of that. And we have a relatively small remaining running room. The truth is, there is no budget. We have to stop now. Which countries are responsible? Well, China produces most of the greenhouse gas emissions per year. The USA is second. But if you look at per capita greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, how we live, the United States is by far the highest. The Russian Federation and China falling in behind us. The moral responsibility, as John Capece pointed out, is with the United States. We put most of the emissions in the air following World War II. Let me make something clear. Physics doesn't care whether or not you're increasing your rate or decreasing your rate. Physics only cares what's in the air at any given point in time. The responsibility for loss and damage must drive COP27. We owe it to the rest of the world. The developed world owes it to the rest of the world, and we've got to take this action. This 2022 study calculates the economic damage caused by the other countries by the top emitters. The United States and China lead the pack. Here are the top 5. The US, China, Russia, India, and Brazil have collectively caused $6 trillion in income losses from warming since 1990. That's roughly 11% of the global GDP. There have been some really bad actors, and this is just a very small fraction of them. This is Rex Tillerson, who for many years was ExxonMobil CEO. He says, we'll adapt to that. Okay, thanks, Rex. This is Willie Soon. He's a climate scientist, and he's a denier. He's received over $1 million from fossil fuel interests. And of course, the Koch brothers, who've created a toxic empire. Interactions among politics, economics, and power relationships are responsible for the lack of urgent action. This is not my words. This is a statement from Working Group 3. Opposition from status quo interests and lack of low carbon financing are primary barriers to action. Climate sciences have been undermined by counter movements, media, and misinformation. Corporations are primary obstructionists to climate action. Future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure will blow by 1.5. In fact, it'll take us by 1.65. The existing infrastructure must be decommissioned. We have to walk away from it. This is William Nordhaus, the Yale University economist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018. He is typical of the field of economics, and he developed models of climate change cost and benefits known as integrated assessment models. And he claimed in one of his early versions that 4 degrees Celsius warming is just fine if the global GDP grows sufficiently. Don't let anybody distract you from the work at hand, which is economic growth. This indeed is the dismal science. The physical sciences and natural sciences have made enormous progress over the last few years. Economics, not so much. The wealthy top 10% of individuals globally are responsible for 36 to 45% of global emissions. No country is currently doing enough or pledging enough to reliably stay below 3. Tech-based carbon dioxide removal cannot provide carbon-free primary energy production. We must kill fossil emissions and manage land use in the biosphere. People need services that can be delivered without energy and materials derived from burning fossil fuels. And massive subsidies for fossil fuels worldwide must end immediately. If you're young, you really should be furious. I'm furious and I'm old. The intergenerational inequities as covered in this particular article in Science are extreme. You can see the current pledges in red, 2 degrees Celsius in orange and 1.5 degrees Celsius. You can see the life expectancy of the 1960 cohort. I've actually outlived my usefulness. And the life expectancy of people born a couple of years ago. And you can see the vast disparity. The 2020 cohort will face 7 times, 6 times, or 4 times the lifetime heat wave exposure. This is what really gets me, is that people born after 2000 will have never experienced the relatively stable climate of the 20th century. By late this century, there will be no one alive who has not lived on a rapidly, progressively disrupted Earth system. Fossil fuel interest and raw power. As Rock mentioned, the fossil fuel delegates, the official delegates, far outnumbered the delegates from any other country. Greta Thunberg said it beautifully, and I couldn't agree more. It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. In terms of its stated goals, it didn't even come close. This is Michael Mann, arguably one of the most recognizable and most pioneering climate scientists in the world. He says the science that we are doing is a threat to the world's most powerful and wealthiest special interests, the most powerful and wealthiest special interest that has ever existed, the fossil fuel industry. They have used their immense resources to create fake scandals and to fund a global disinformation campaign aimed at vilifying the scientists, discrediting the science, and misleading the public and policymakers. Arguably, it is the most villainous act in the history of human civilization because it is about the short-term interests of a small number of plutocrats over the long-term welfare of this planet and the people who live on it. People, we need to move. We need to get active. Here are just a few of the concerns about the credibility of the COP27. Egypt has used authoritarian rule to silence dissent, limit access by activists, and hired a notorious greenwashing firm for its public relations. How much of the agenda and outcome will the fossil fuel industry and its allies control? Will the petrostates continue to significantly influence the recommendations for adaptation and mitigation? Loss and damage for the global south must be addressed and rapidly deploy a system of meaningful aid. Wealthy nations must stop using most of the resources and allocate proportionally more to the global south and poorer nations. Here's one of the most important statements that you can find in the assessment report number 6, working group 3. It states that globally we must employ degrowth as an economic model. This means rapidly ending neoliberal capitalism based on extraction and exploitation. I realize this is a bit much to ask for. It's probably not reasonable, but I think this really states where we have to be at this point in time. So these are some courses that I'm teaching next semester at UF, Climate Change and Human Systems, One Health. And in the fall, I'll be teaching my flagship course, Climate Change Biology. So I'll stop my share at this point. I don't know if I have time for questions. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Not at all, Dr. Mulkey. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. We do have, I'm going to give two questions here. The first is from Dustin from UF, and Dustin says, thank you so much, Dr. Mulkey. I would have been disappointed if this year at Campus Climate Corps you didn't come present. I love all your talks as always. I'm participating in Campus Climate Corps, or I've registered to participate in Campus Climate Corps, and I'm a part of the Sunrise Movement. What specific actions do you think a student on the UF campus can and should take if they don't think that local organizations are doing enough to address the climate crisis from a local perspective?
Well, as you can tell, I don't just teach the science. For this particular issue, I'm not a dispassionate, objective scientist. There is no such thing, in fact. But I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's impossible to see the changes that are happening. Young people need to be willing to get uncomfortable and loud. You need to challenge the leadership of the youth organizations. If they're having a conference, the COY conference is inaccessible, or it's too superficial, you need to challenge it. You need to demand more. People need to step up to the plate, and you really need to develop your scholarship. So look at Greta Thunberg. She knows her scholarship, and she's 18 years old. She really knows the literature, and she's done that mostly on her own. Her new climate book, The Climate Book, is an outstanding review of not only the socioeconomic, socio-ecological, and scientific, physical, and natural science issues of climate change. It is put together in a very readable fashion for a lay audience. So get pointed up, engage in the scholarship, learn, read, talk to a lot of people, and by all means, protest. Get out there and be loud and challenge those who are not taking us where we need to go fast enough. I mean, we're out of time and we're out of excuses.
Thank you. Wonderful answer to that question. And thank you, Dustin, for the question. Rhonda Roth asks, is peak oil a factor, or did fracking buy us enough time to cook ourselves? To clarify, is there a time at which we'll run out and have to switch?
Yeah, but it'll be too late. I mean, if you want to run the numbers, the fossil fuel industry is making bank right now. They're gouging prices and they're putting the money in the bank. I think they know their days are numbered, but that's not because the supply is diminishing. They're using captured CO2 from carbon capture and sequestration facilities and from direct air facilities, which are very few, but the carbon capture and sequestration facilities are relatively significant around the world, and they're expanding. But what happens with that captured CO2? Well, they're mixing it with solutions, and they're forcing it down into dried out oil wells to extract every last bit of oil. This is tertiary oil extraction. It's called enhanced oil recovery. 75% of the captured CO2 is presently used for enhanced oil recovery. These guys aren't going to run out. They've got massive explorations all over the world to find new deposits. So peak oil is immaterial. It's a dead issue. The only issue that matters is killing the fossil fuel industry and stopping their allies and the petrostates. We have to coalesce, come together as a world. And my greatest hope is that the awareness is becoming greater all over the world among people of all generations. And the youth movement, as witnessed at Glasgow COP26, is now huge. And the youth are extremely skeptical as well they should be. I would be skeptical too. I am skeptical. I could go on. I'll quit. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Mulkey. As always, you do such an amazing presentation. So thank you. We right now have our next speaker, Dr. Lichstein, who is currently with us. So Dr. Lichstein, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. I have a short bio for him. Dr. Lichstein received his PhD in 2007 from Princeton University in ecology and evolutionary biology. His postdoc from 2007 to 2010 at Princeton. Is currently a faculty member in the UF biology department from 2011 to the present. And his teaching and research focus on ecology in general, and more specifically, the terrestrial carbon cycle and its role in regulating Earth's climate. I do believe that we have a wonderful mix between students and professors and the scientists here today, really to showcase just how important it is to have the science at our disposal. As Dr. Mulkey mentioned, like Greta Thunberg, we need to have the science at our disposal, tools in our arsenal to really fight this fight. Dr. Lichstein, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will pass the baton to you.
Okay, thanks, Rock. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Well, it's an honor and pretty interesting to speak after Dr. Mulkey. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is more in the realm of basic science. What do we understand? What do we not understand about the global carbon cycle? Certainly, Dr. Mulkey is, you may not know this, but he has made some important contributions in that realm as well. So there's a lot of important and interesting questions about plant physiology that is kind of the nuts and bolts behind some of the things I'm going to be talking to you about. And so at other stages in his career, I think that Dr. Mulkey was kind of under the hood, so to speak, and making important contributions in that realm of science. So without further ado, so I guess I need to share my screen. Okay, so what you're seeing here is it's an image, it's a colorized image that's showing the density of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. And so what we're about to see here is an animation over a year. Let's see, is this working? There we go. So what you're seeing are primarily driven by natural processes. So the red colors, the hot colors, are higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can see they're building up in the northern hemisphere during the autumn and winter. And when we get to the spring, those concentrations in the north, are going to come down. So we're starting out here in the summer. So CO2 in the atmosphere is low in the north. And that's because during the northern growing season, there's more photosynthesis than respiration, which is the process that returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So this is a natural phenomenon. There's a global seasonal cycle in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that is driven primarily by the large land area in the northern hemisphere. It just so happens that there is more land in the northern hemisphere than in the south, and much of the land in the southern hemisphere is in Antarctica, which is not biologically very active. The land has a strongly seasonal biological cycle. The oceans do too, but it's less seasonal in the oceans. So we get this pattern where there is this long-term trend towards more CO2 in the atmosphere, and we know that humans are causing that. But superimposed on that, there's also this very dramatic seasonal cycle. And I just wanted to show this to illustrate the potentially very strong role that ecosystems have on the global carbon cycle. So this is, these are data that I think you've seen before, just showing the increase in global surface temperatures over the last 140 years. We know that the increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is the primary cause for that. Probably the next biggest contributor is probably our methane emissions, other greenhouse gases. You can see these wiggles. So that's the little wiggles in that are superimposed on the long-term trend. That is that's this seasonal cycle in that animation I was just showing you. So number one, why do we make such a big deal about carbon dioxide? Some of you may have heard, perhaps from a climate change skeptic, that CO2 is not the most important greenhouse gas. That's true. If you want to ask why is there life on Earth at all? Why are temperatures warm enough for life to exist on Earth? The answer is the greenhouse gas effect. And the most important greenhouse gas effect is water vapor. So CO2 is the second most important greenhouse gas in terms of its total effect on Earth's climate, but it's not the most important. And it's also not the most potent on a per molecule basis. Methane and many other greenhouse gases are more potent on a per molecule basis. The reason we make such a big deal about CO2 is because among the greenhouse gases whose atmospheric concentrations are directly affected by human activities, and water vapor is not one of them, CO2 is by far the most common, and it has the biggest effect on climate and climate change. You can think of water vapor as a multiplier. Anything we do to heat up the planet will result in there being more water vapor in the atmosphere. And that will just exaggerate the warming that we cause from our CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gas emissions. But there's not an industrial process. Humans do not directly put a lot of water vapor into the atmosphere. And so although the fact that it's in the atmosphere makes the Earth warm enough to be habitable and for life to exist. And furthermore, water vapor will amplify any other warming that humans cause. But it's not the proximate cause. It's not the thing that humans are controlling to heat up the planet. Those things are CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases. This is a summary of, hold on just a moment. Okay, this is a summary of the global CO2 budget. So for example, each year, so this big red arrow on the left, humans are putting about 33 gigatons, those are billions of tons, 33 billions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. And another 3 or 4 billion tons of CO2 from land use change, primarily deforestation in the tropics. So that's about 37 billion tons of CO2 each year. If you were to take just the mass of the carbon atoms in the CO2, it'd be about 10 billion tons of carbon each year. Only about half of that stays in the atmosphere. So if you look at the number for the atmospheric growth, okay, that's the rate at which the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing each year. It's a little less than half of what we are putting into the atmosphere. And so where is the other half going? Well, some of it is sequestered by what this slide calls the land. So the land sink, and some is sequestered by the ocean sink. So the land and oceans each offset about a quarter of our annual carbon emissions to the atmosphere So together they're offsetting about half. Only about half of what we put into the atmosphere each year stays there. Now, so why? So number one, the land sink, what does the land mean here? Well, it can mean several things. It can mean plants, so carbon stored in living biomass, animals too, other organisms too, but plants make up the vast majority of the biomass on land. It could be carbon stored in soil, which would ultimately be derived from plant biomass. And it could be carbon stored in inland waters, meaning freshwater wetlands, reservoirs. When agricultural soils are eroded, they take carbon with them, and that carbon ends up somewhere. So it could end up being stabilized in the sediments of reservoirs, lakes, other inland water bodies. Again, without these land and ocean sinks, atmospheric CO2 would be rising about twice as fast as it currently is. These sinks are the result of natural processes, but they're in a sense not natural. These land and ocean sinks reflect a disequilibrium of the Earth system that we have created over the last century and principally over the last 3 or 4 decades. So in other words, prior to the Industrial Revolution, for many thousands of years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was very stable. And that indicates that the land and oceans and atmosphere were at or close to being at equilibrium with each other. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Other than I just want to emphasize the existence of these sinks does rely on natural processes. But they are in some ways a response to the novel anthropogenic atmosphere that we have created. You can add up all of the cumulative carbon emissions from different sources, and you can ask, so prior to the Industrial Revolution, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 280 ppm, parts per million. So out of every million molecules in the atmosphere, about 280 of them were CO2. Now we're at about 420. And we can ask, how much did different sources contribute to that rise from 280 to 420? So there was a big contribution from burning coal, from burning oil, natural gas, etc. You can ask, well, where would we be if there were no land and ocean sinks? And we would already be past the goal of the Paris Treaty. So this is perhaps where we might like to see atmospheric CO2 stabilized to limit global warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius. We would already be way past that without these land and ocean sinks. So what causes these sinks? The global ocean carbon sink is primarily caused by a pretty simple process, which is CO2 diffusing down a concentration gradient. There's a lot of interesting biology in the oceans, phytoplankton, zooplankton. There's a whole ocean carbon cycle that could, in principle, affect the global ocean carbon balance. We believe that currently all that interesting biology is roughly carbon neutral with respect to the atmosphere. So basically just as much, roughly the same amount of photosynthesis bringing carbon into the oceans from the atmosphere, that's roughly in balance with the amount of metabolism or respiration putting carbon back into the atmosphere. But what's not in balance is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and how much CO2 is in the ocean water. So the surface ocean waters come into equilibrium with the atmosphere on a roughly 1-year time scale, but the surface waters also get mixed down into the deeper oceans. and water from the deep ocean that has not been exposed to the atmosphere for several centuries comes up to the surface. So it takes a long time because the vertical mixing of the oceans is slow. It will take a long time for the concentration of CO2 in the ocean water to come into equilibrium with the atmosphere. And it's that disequilibrium that is the primary cause of the global ocean carbon sink. So the consequences of the ocean sink are, well, there's a reduced growth rate of atmospheric CO2. So as I've already mentioned, CO2 is rising in the atmosphere slower than it would without the global ocean sink. Of course, this is exactly what is causing ocean acidification. So there's both a glass half full and a glass half empty side of this. What causes the global carbon sink? Number one, how do we know there's a global carbon sink? It's very difficult to measure the land sink directly. I won't go into it, but it's expensive but fairly straightforward to take measurements that allow us to estimate the global ocean sink. That is not true on land. It's kind of prohibitively expensive to measure it directly. So usually the way we estimate the global land sink is we start with this equation, which is a very simple equation for the global carbon budget. How quickly is CO2 increasing in the atmosphere? That's the term on the left side of the equal sign. Well, that's equal to how quickly we're emitting carbon to the atmosphere minus the ocean sink, minus what the ocean sequester, minus what the land sequesters. We have pretty good estimates for 3 of these 4 numbers, basically all of them except for the land sink. So we can just rearrange this equation. And this is the kind of most reliable way to quantify the land sink. And this is what has led to the conclusion that the land must be sequestering about 1/4 of our annual carbon emissions, because it's got to be going somewhere. There's only a certain amount of those emissions that are staying in the atmosphere. We have good data on that. We have pretty good estimates of the ocean sink. So the rest of it must be on land somewhere. What will happen to the land sink in the future? Will it get stronger and offset even more of our carbon emissions? Or will it get weaker and possibly becoming a source of carbon to the atmosphere? For example, because permafrost is melting and carbon that's locked up in, that was locked up in frozen soil for maybe many thousands of years is now that soil is thawing and all of that carbon is becoming available to microbes to decompose and put back into the atmosphere. Or will the land carbon sink weaken because tropical forests become stressed by rising temperatures and variable or reducing rainfall? So there's a number of things that could cause this land sink to weaken in the future. So to understand or predict what will happen to the land sink in the future requires an understanding of what's causing it now. And hopefully it was clear from my earlier slides that the magnitude of the land sink has implications for how much work we have to do as a society to stabilize atmospheric CO2. If the land sink is bigger and it gets bigger in the future, then we're looking better. If the land sink weakens or even changes sign and becomes a source of carbon to the atmosphere, that means we are in an even more desperate situation to take bigger actions sooner to stabilize atmospheric CO2 and to mitigate climate change. Okay, so what causes the land sink? One of the things that causes the land sink is pretty well understood, and it's illustrated by this time sequence of forest cover in the US from pre-settlement to the present. So you can see from, say, 1620 to 1920, we lost most of the forest cover in the US, and that represents carbon emissions to the atmosphere. However, over the last roughly 100 years, we have gotten back some of that forest cover. It doesn't mean we've gotten back our pristine old growth forests, but we do have a large area of maturing and somewhat mature forests. Most dramatically in the eastern US, we have much more forest cover than we did 100 years ago. So there's also things like in the western US, because of, for example, fire suppression, we have woody shrubs moving into grasslands. That's not necessarily good for biodiversity, but it does result in a carbon sink. And it's something we need to quantify and understand if we want to be able to predict the future of the land sink. So this is one mechanism that is most important in northern temperate latitudes. So the USA, China, Europe, there has been an increase in forest cover over the last few decades. And that's one of the mechanisms that we know contributes to the land sink. Another one that we actually don't know if this contributes to the land sink, but we think it probably does. And it is the most prominent hypothesis for what could cause a carbon sink on land of the magnitude needed to balance the global carbon budget. So the idea here is pretty simple. One of the things that plants need to grow is carbon dioxide. If you increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can fertilize photosynthesis and therefore increase ecosystem carbon storage. And there have been a number of both laboratory as well as field experiments called free air CO2 enrichment experiments shown here that have been designed to test the hypothesis that increasing CO2 will lead to faster plant growth and more ecosystem carbon storage. And that hypothesis has been confirmed under field conditions using the kinds of experiments shown here. But one of the things that these experiments show, if you let them run for more than 5 or 6 years, eventually the CO2 fertilization response appears to weaken. And probably because at some point, the ecosystem is no longer limited by CO2. It becomes limited by nitrogen or water or something else. So there's still, although if you look at the photosynthesis equation, it's pretty obvious that rising CO2 should lead to more photosynthesis. You can bring little plants into growth chambers in highly controlled experimental conditions and confirm that more CO2 will make little plants grow faster. It's much less certain how this will play out in real ecosystems over the long term, where there's a lot of complicated stuff happening, like competition for below ground resources. So I think this is still an active area of research, trying to understand to what extent CO2 fertilization could account for the land sink that has been inferred from global carbon budgets. I think I don't have a lot of time left, and this is a bit of a busy slide, but don't try to ingest all the symbols and colors. Let me just tell you what it means. A compilation of forest inventory data from all over the world demonstrated or suggested that there is a large carbon sink in intact, that is old growth tropical forests. And the most plausible mechanism for that observation would be CO2 fertilization. There's a lot of deforestation in the tropics. There's a lot of regrowth of secondary forests in the tropics. But the thing that allowed this analysis to produce a balanced global carbon budget, that is to account for the land sink that is inferred from looking at our emissions, the atmospheric growth rate of CO2, and the ocean sink, to account for the land sink implied by that global carbon budget, they were able to come up with enough carbon storage to balance the global land sink based on a limited amount of data that was then kind of scaled up to the global area of intact tropical forests. If you believe their data and their methods, they were able to balance the global carbon budget. So in other words, there is at least one analysis that's now been cited many thousands of times that suggests that that intact tropical forests are a large carbon sink, and that the only mechanism we know of, well, the most likely mechanism that would cause a carbon sink in these old growth forests is CO2 fertilization. On the other hand, I already mentioned inland waters. So this is an analysis of this is another kind of global synthesis of data. So the numbers here are gigatons of carbon per year. So if you recall, I told you that each year we put about 36 gigatons or 36 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, which if you just look at the carbon atoms, which is what these numbers refer to, it's about 10 billion tons or 10 gigatons of carbon that humans emit to the atmosphere each year. So that's just to put these numbers in perspective. We're talking about the land transporting through various mechanisms, CO2 carried in groundwater. So as soil organic matter decomposes, as roots do metabolism, CO2 is released into the soil, and some of that CO2 gets dissolved in groundwater. And when it rains, that dissolved CO2 gets washed into streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands, etc. There's also particulate organic matter. So leaf litter, wood, stuff falls into rivers or gets blown into rivers or gets eroded into rivers. Some of this stuff ends up making its way to the oceans. Some of it gets outgassed to the atmosphere. Some of it gets buried in the sediments of reservoirs and wetlands. These numbers are probably too small. Okay, so there's 1.2 gigatons of CO2 or 1.2 gigatons of carbon outgassed to the atmosphere each year is probably more like a 3 or a 4. The amount of carbon buried in the sediments of inland waters each year is probably more like 2 or 3 times this 0.6 number. And so to accommodate these bigger losses from these inland waters, the carbon's got to come from somewhere. It means that the amount of carbon flowing from the land to these inland waters, that estimate would also have to be revised upward. Where's the carbon sink here? It's in these buried sediments, okay? Outgassing carbon to the atmosphere. If this number is too small, that challenges our understanding of the global carbon cycle. But in particular, if the burial of carbon in sediments is say, well, what if it was 2.5 gigatons of carbon each year? That's the entire global land sink. That means that us forest ecologists who are running around in forest looking to account for the global land sink, we're looking in the wrong place. Because if we can balance the global carbon budget just from sediments and reservoirs, that means there can't be a land sink in a forest or a grassland. So as the aquatic ecologists and geochemists come to a better understanding of where carbon is going into and how much carbon is leaving or being sequestered in inland waters, that challenges our understanding of what's happening in terrestrial ecosystems. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Again, the land and ocean carbon sinks sequester about half of our annual anthropogenic carbon emissions. The ocean sink is reasonably well understood. It's expected to slowly weaken over time. The land sink is poorly understood. we're confident that part of it is due to the regrowth of northern forests from previous land use, like agricultural clearing and industrial scale logging. It's likely, but not certain, that CO2 fertilization of terrestrial ecosystems plays a role in the global land sink. An unknown fraction of the land sink occurs in inland waters. If this fraction turns out to be large, then what we previously thought we understood about the global carbon budget, we have to throw that out and start over. And so really my take-home message for you is that there's a lot we don't understand about ecosystems and how they will affect the global carbon budget and climate change. That should not be an excuse for inaction. It's pretty clear what we need to do as a society to make progress on this problem. We don't have perfect scientific information. Having perfect information would be good, and scientists are trying to improve our understanding. In the meantime, there's no question about how we should get started. There is no possibility that these land and ocean sinks will prevent climate change from happening. At best, they will continue to offset about half of our emissions. That doesn't stop climate change from happening. So I just want to be crystal clear that none of this uncertainty should be an excuse for inaction. But I also want to make any of you who are interested in a career in science, there's a lot to do in the realm of science that is relevant to climate change and is not yet understood. With that, I'm going to stop, and if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take some.
Dr. Lichstein, thank you so much for that presentation. I personally really enjoyed it, and we actually have a bunch of questions. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit behind on time, so I think I picked out a good one. So we got time for one. One student, Sandra, asks, what about the warming oceans? You talk about the ocean sink, but doesn't the warming of the ocean slow the ability of the ocean to continue being a sink? Is what the ocean sequesters a hard number in an equation, or is this changing over time due to climate change and increased carbon, increased carbon in the atmosphere?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The ocean, so the warming of the oceans could affect the ocean sink in several ways. I think the one that is best understood is that as you heat up the Earth, the oceans become more thermally stratified, which means the upper ocean layers becomes, the difference in temperature between the surface water and the deep water becomes greater. So when you have hot water resting on top of cold water, that's a stable configuration, because cold water is denser, hot water is less dense. So as you heat up the surface water, it actually slows down the vertical mixing of the oceans. And I don't know if you remember, I said that the main thing that causes the ocean sink is the vertical mixing of the oceans. So anything that makes the ocean stratification greater, the thermal stratification greater, that will slow down the vertical mixing, and that will weaken the ocean carbon sink. There are other reasons why it will weaken over time. Just for example, eventually the oceans will come into equilibrium with the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And at that point, the ocean sink will cease to exist. So yeah, it will weaken over time. It's currently, if it's offsetting a quarter of our emissions now, in 50 years, that might be 20%. It's probably not going to get to 0% anytime soon, but it's moving in a direction that will not help us stabilize the Earth's climate. I'd just say I'm happy to take questions by email. So if folks want to send you any questions, Rock, I can answer those questions at another time.
Absolutely. I do have a bunch here. So everyone in the chats on each of our platforms, as Dr. Lichstein just mentioned, if you have questions, please send them my way. Or, Dr. Lichstein is a professor here at the University of Florida, so his email should be listed on the system. I'll probably just grab it from, your webpage in the UFL system and post it for everyone to see.
Sure.
But yeah, I see a bunch of really good questions here. Don't let them go away. And of course, if we're honored enough to have Dr. Lichstein join us on one of our daily briefings for maybe a little bit more of extended time to ask him some questions, hopefully we can arrange that too. But thank you so much, Dr. Lichstein. Really do appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Also, I do have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, and I also have the pleasure of working for him as his TA. Our next speaker, of course, is Dr. Leslie Thiele. Dr. Leslie Thiele is a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Florida. He directs the Sustainability Studies program at the Center for Adaptive Innovation, Resilience, and Ethics in Science, also known as UF Cares. Dr. Leslie Thiele also serves as the specialty chief editor of the Politics of Technology section of Frontiers in Political Science. His research and teaching focuses on sustainability, emerging technology, and the intersection of political philosophy and the natural sciences. Thank you so much, Dr. Thiele, for joining us today. I really do appreciate it and looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, can you hear me, Rock?
I can hear you just fine.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to be brief today. Jeremy gave a great in-depth presentation. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing? And I'm not going to actually talk about climate science because it's been well covered, or at least certain aspects of it have been well covered. So I think I'll speak about something that students may be interested in when it comes to climate change issues, and that is the size of the problem and the apparent meagerness of efforts to address it. And I think many people feel a certain intimidation in the face of the size of the problem and what they can muster in terms of efforts to address it in a meaningful way. So I'm going to address sort of the politics of that, or at least the political potentialities of that, bringing to fore two social scientific discoveries. One of them, both of them in some sense were discoveries of the natural sciences, but they have social scientific application. The first one addresses the question, how quick can meaningful change be? And the discovery was something called phase transitions. So, when ice, when water turns into ice, it doesn't happen gradually. It happens at 0 degrees centigrade. It happens pretty quickly when the temperature reaches that level. The same is true for a lot of different things. You can have traffic flowing quite smoothly on roads, and you can keep adding cars, and the traffic will continue to go quite smoothly. But once you add one too many cars and you achieve a certain density, traffic jams start occurring. And that can happen quite quickly with just the addition of 1 or 2 extra cars to, as it were, a saturated roadway. Likewise, forest fires spread quickly with certain densities of trees, as well as wind speed and humidity. And that's why we have now a science of controlled burns and prescribed burns, which help address how some very big forest fires can form if certain conditions are met. So that's just to say that in the natural world and in the social world, change can happen very quickly if the preconditions are met. The next discovery is something called a power law. And that's something that natural sciences have used this discovery, and mathematics has used it. A power law is simply a relative change in one quantity that gives rise to a proportional relative change in the other quantity. independent of the initial sizes of those quantities. Well, that's kind of obscure, but let me give you an example. If you have a cube, if you double the length of the side of the cube, you actually multiply the volume of the cube by a factor of 8. So there you have a relationship. It's 2 times one of the sides equals 8 times the volume. And that's a power law because you really have to do very little in terms of what you do to the side. You only have to double it to get 8 times the amount of volume. Power laws apply through mathematics. They also apply in the natural world and they apply in the social world. In the social world, the power laws were brought to fore primarily by a man named Vilfredo Pareto, living at in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was an Italian sociologist, an economist, political scientist, a bit of a philosopher and engineer as well. And he discovered in his native country of Italy that 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. He thought that was peculiar. He went on to figure out that 80% of the income was earned by 20% of the population, and 80% of a company's profits are generally come from about 20% of its customers, and that 80% of its sales come from about 20% of its products. Pareto went on to coin a term called the 80-20 rule. It's also called the Pareto principle, and it's come to be called the principle of the vital few. 80-20 seems to be kind of the ratio that takes place most of the time in the social world. And you can probably see this in your own life. Probably something like 20% of the people you know will provide you about 80% of your companionships and friendships. 20% of the time you spend doing things will provide you with 80% of your enjoyment. And 20% of your problems will cause you 80% of your stress and anxiety. Likewise, you'll probably wear about 20% of your clothes 80% of the time and listen to 20% of your music about 80% of the time. So it's a familiar, the 80-20 rule or the principle of the vital few is something that takes place not only in the natural world or in mathematics, but also in the social world. Generally, if you're looking at the power law, the principle of the vital few, you can summarize it by saying about 80% of effects come from about 20% of causes. So how does that come into play with what we're talking about today, which is to say how many people are needed to affect real change? You really only need 20% of a population to affect significant change within that population. I'm going to give you an example about that later, but let me come at this from a slightly different angle. Some of you have probably heard of Buckminster Fuller. He was a sort of a Renaissance man, designed the geodesic dome and had all sorts of other discoveries. On his gravestone, he was called Bucky. So on Bucky's gravestone, he has these words, "Call me trim tab." So what is a trim tab? Well, this is how Buckminster Fuller describes a trim tab and why he put it on his gravestone. He says, think of the Queen Mary. That's this huge ship. It's not functioning any longer, I don't think. The whole ship goes by and then comes the rudder. And then there's a tiny thing at the edge of the rudder called a trim tab. It's like a miniature rudder. Just moving the trim tab builds a slow pressure that pulls the rudder around. Takes almost no effort at all. And then when you pull the rudder around, the ship comes around. So I said that the little individual can be a trim tab. Society thinks it's going right by you and that it's left you altogether. But if you're doing dynamic things, the fact is you can just put your foot out like that trim tab and the whole big ship of state is going to turn. So I said, call me trim tab. And that's what he put on his gravestone. So again, trim tab is just, if you've got the big ship and you've got the rudder on it, there's just this little piece on the end of the rudder called the trim tab. You move that helps push the rudder and the rudder helps push the whole ship. So the trim tab is kind of like the vital few. It just gives a more sort of a visual of that. So how many people does it take to make change? Well, using power laws and notions of trim tabs and principles of the vital few, let me give you an example. Let's say you're on a university campus, something like the University of Florida, and you want to make a change on that campus by way of a referendum or initiative. Well, UF has about 53,000 students, less than about 9,000 vote during any particular elections. So you need basically about 3/5 of those voting to pass an initiative. You know, about 45. You need about 5,400 students to vote for your proposed change for it to pass. The 3/5 of those voting to pass an initiative is just something that happens to be in the UF Constitution. Other universities may only need half, in which case you need less. But at UF, if you want to make a change, given that 9,000 people vote, you'd need about 2/3 of those, or 3/5 of those, sorry. So that's about 5,400 students. That's about 10% of the student body. If you assume that about 1/3 of voters will approve your initiative without the need of being persuaded, then you really only need to convince 2/3 of 5,400 students, or about 3,600 students. And if you assume that members of campus clubs and organizations vote more regularly and can be more easily organized to vote, then you might choose to concentrate your efforts on clubs and organizations that could bring out 3,600 student voters. That could be less than, say, 100 clubs or organizations. And if you assume that maybe, say, 200 students with good communication skills could convince 100 clubs and organizations to back the initiative, then 200 students is all you need to make a change that will impact a population of 53,000 students. That's less than 1% of the student population. And these 100 students would be, or 200 students would be the trim tabs, the vital few. So that gives you a sense of how a small number of people can have a large change. I'm going to come at it from one other direction and address something called the ripple effect. So at the height of apartheid in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was in prison, a visiting American senator said these words: "I came here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent. A land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage." I refer, of course, to the United States of America. So that person was Robert F. Kennedy. And he was trying to suggest that coming to apartheid South Africa, he had perhaps not the right place to preach about liberty and equality, because in his own land of the United States of America, they had a much similar history and many of the same problems. But this is one thing that Robert F. Kennedy said before he was tragically assassinated. "Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest wall of oppression and resistance." So whether you think of yourself as a trim tab or one of the vital few, or simply a ripple of hope whose personal example is serving to ripple out and influence others, my point today is simply that it can take very few people to actually have a powerful impact in the realm of politics and society, or in the realm of climate change more generally. I think I'll stop there.
Dr. Thiele, thank you so much. I actually have a bunch of questions. I really wish you weren't running so low on time, but I think I have a good one here. This is from Sheila, who says she was one of your former students, and she says, "I want to be a part of a trim," or she's first of all thanks you, and then says, "I want to be a part of a trim tab, but I'm afraid of public speaking. Do you think shy people can still cause change even on a campus like UF?"
Yeah, Yeah, good question. Yeah, public speaking is something that many people fear. In fact, it's often rated higher than death is the thing that people fear most. So you're not alone there. And sure, I mean, I think that the vital few, in my example, the people that need to organize, 100 clubs or so on a campus to make vital change, don't need to all make it by public speaking. You're going to need people that are going to, organize the public speakers to go and make the presentations. There's a lot of people doing a lot of the work in the background that are absolutely vital. If you go to any nonprofit agency, any government agency, it doesn't matter. They all have their spokespeople, and then they have twice, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times as many people working behind the front line to organize things and get things done. So I don't think you have to be a spokesperson. I don't think you have to be a public speaker. You simply have to be collaborating with other people, out of which some people are willing to sort of be in the limelight.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful answer to the question. Unfortunately, like I said, I wish we had more time for questions, but we're running into the time for our next speaker after this. So Dr. Thiele, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Everyone really appreciates it. Folks, for everyone who's been posting questions, Dr. Thiele is a faculty here at the University of Florida. If you have any questions, I'm sure, would you mind if they emailed you with their follow-up questions?
Yeah,
wonderful.
Just my last name at ufl.edu.
Wonderful. All right, everyone, you heard it. Thiele at ufl.edu. Thank you so much, Dr. Thiele. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Okay, really quickly, we have a presentation by Michael Fiedler, who is on board with us as one of our folks on the ground in Egypt. He's already taken advantage of the situation and pulled together some information for us. So we're going to showcase his material before we get to our next speaker. Okay, folks, and here we go. Oh, wait a minute, I have to share with sound on. There we go.
Thank you for the floor, and let me walk you through my presentation, which is called the visual tour of COI and COP. So I will not really be talking that much. I shall be showing mostly images so you get a better idea how things look like at COI, at COP. Actually, let me explain what COI is. It's an abbreviation for Conference of Youth, which usually takes place roughly 3 or 4 days prior to COP, the main UN event on climate change, which lasts roughly 2 weeks. So COI is just a shorter event where young people, students gather together and prepare their agenda and other stuff for the main conference for COP. Well, as some of the images should show, COI is mostly about discussions among young people, various presentations, performances. There are often also games. Usually there is also an artistic area where young artists show their art. Typically, COI is held within a university campus. What I like the most about COIs is there is always a lot of positive spirit, a lot of optimism. It's because young people are still very optimistic and they see the future in hopefully better way than it really is. One of the downsides of COI is that it's every year organized by a different group of people. So the new group of people starts from a scratch. There is really no continuation of the knowledge gathered last year. So that's one of the main difficulties there. So sometimes it feels a little bit disorganized. Things change at the very last minute. But on the other hand, this is a good preparation for handling similar events in the future. So it's a good learning opportunity as well. Campus Climate Corp has been attending these conferences since 2015 Paris. Eventually, we also came up with an approach or a concept of virtual attendance or virtual posters one of the ways how we could reduce our greenhouse gases footprint, since we were not all of us were attending in person, but we were attending virtually. So in a way, this proved to be a visionary approach, if you will, because given the COVID situation that happened just a little later after we came up with this concept, the whole world basically had to learn how to communicate virtually. Now let's move on to COP or COP, which is an abbreviation for Conference of Parties. COP is the main UNFCCC gathering and takes place once a year and lasts for about 2 weeks. So this is a very thorough conference. COP should happen in a different continent every year, although there are also some shifts based on the situation. For example, in 2017, when the conference was supposed to take place in Fiji, it was moved to Bonn, Germany for logistical reasons. Or in 2019, when it was scheduled to take place in Santiago de Chile, it was moved to Madrid for security reasons. COP attracts a really high number of people. It's typically between 20 and 30,000 participants of the conference, and those are experts on climate change and a range of other scientific issues. There are always activists, or we would say observers. There are also politicians who attend. By the way, there is this World Leaders Summit where 100 plus presidents and prime ministers meet, typically during the first 2 days of COP. Sometimes also the media stars, if you will, show up. Actors, actresses, and so on, but mostly there are technocrats, governmental officers, negotiators, and that's the core of COP. COP is an event presented worldwide, so you get to meet a bunch of journalists from all over the world. And again, it is a global event, and although we are not CNN or BBC, we at Campus Climate Corp try to add our little part in reporting from COP. So consider tuning in to our daily broadcast during the next 2 weeks. For the organizational part, there is an area for the negotiators and high-level politicians, which is not so easily accessible for the observers. But there is also this area with the pavilions, and there are national, regional, and other types of pavilions focused on a specific topic, for example, oceans or rainforests. And there are typically tens of these various pavilions, and in most of them, there is something going on all the time, whether it would be an educational program, presentations, discussions, open panels, and so on. So there is of course, well, after 2 weeks of negotiations and presentations, people need to relax since they get so tired. So last year, one of the afternoons in the Pakistani pavilions was spent just with cricket, watching cricket. But seriously, this is an opportunity to meet world-class scientists, network with other similar-minded people. So a great chance in these pavilions to learn something new. An integral part of every COP are demonstrations. They either happen within the premises or within the venue, and they also happen outside, so in town where COP takes place. This year in Egypt, it might be a bit difficult for the demonstrations to take place, given the various restrictions here, but young people and activists try their best to be heard and to let the politicians know that they are tired of promises and want things change now. And finally, there are these hard or difficult to access premises where the actual negotiation take place, whether these are the plenary rooms or the workrooms. So sometimes things just happen behind the door or behind the closed door. And when you get into these rooms, there are discussions going on for hours and hours. So me, not being a politician with a lot of patience, sometimes I just find it difficult to spend time in some of these sessions. So to wrap up this short presentation, COI is an interesting learning opportunity worth a visit. COP is an awesome learning opportunity, absolutely worth a visit. So if you can, come and see. If you can't make it, join our upcoming broadcasts. And with that being said, I'm returning the floor back. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. Really appreciate it. Hopefully everyone got a good opportunity to learn just a little bit about what it looks like inside COI COP. I now have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Matthew Solomon. Matthew Solomon is an analyst with the Climate Policy Initiative in their San Francisco office. He's worked across CPI's practice areas, including as the project lead for tracking private financial institutions' commitments to the Paris alignment, and as a co-author of the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, primarily tracking public finance flows and managing back-end data processes. Matthew, we are honored to have you today as our next presenter. Thank you so much for your time, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thanks all for having me. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Just let me know when you can see that.
Oh, you're good to go. Yeah, you can see it.
Awesome, excellent. So yeah, thanks again for having me today and to share my and CPI's work on tracking climate finance. So as Rock said, as a bit of background, I work at Climate Policy Initiative, which is an analysis and advisory organization with expertise in finance and policy. So we work with governments, businesses, and financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. So for more than a decade, CPI has published a biannual report called the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which tracks and analyzes the amount of money that's spent on climate solutions each year. This report is one of the most trusted sources of this data and is used by institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UNFCCC in their biannual assessment. So my comments today, are informed by the landscape report, which actually just came out last week, and which includes climate finance through 2020 with an estimate for 2021. And the delay there is just based on data availability from a few key data sources. So so the CPI finds that in 2019 and 2020, annual climate finance flows reached $653 billion on average. While public and private actors have steadily increased their climate investments in the past decade, the rate of increase has slowed in the last few years, which is a fairly disturbing trend. The flows increased by only 10% in 2019 and 2020 compared to the previous 2 years. As you can see from this graph, this rate of increase is much slower than the previous periods when annual climate finance flows were increasing by more than 20% every year. And so overall, we're seeing a roughly 7% growth rate in climate finance since we started tracking in 2011. This growth is likely to continue through 2021. Initial estimates we gathered are that global climate finance reached $850 billion. Now, this is just an estimate and does not incorporate all of our data sources. So the final number, which will be published sometime in fall next year, is likely to be a little bit higher, but around 850 billion. So despite this growth, there remains a significant gap between current flows and what's needed for a successful low carbon transition. For this year's report, we've done a literature review on the climate mitigation and adaptation investment needed to achieve net zero through various pathways. So as you can see on this graph, we can see through 2011 on the very bottom of the graph in the dark green, we have current investment. And then we have the gap to investment needed and the investment range that's needed. So as you can see, there's a huge gap between current levels of financing and what's going to be required to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, which we estimate would entail approximately a 20% year-on-year increase through 2030 to get to $4.3 trillion. So while there's no single definitive estimate of investment required to achieve global climate goals, our analysis indicates that the finance should count at least in the trillions, not billions, and therefore the incremental increases we've seen so far will not be sufficient. And I'll note that every year that we delay, the needs will increase. And so in addition to increasing climate finance amounts, achieving a 1.5 degrees C path requires a reduction in financing of high emissions activities as well. And we don't track that, but that is a key factor. And just to be clear, these trillions are not unrealistic numbers or unavailable funds. The money is there. We calculate that it's approximately 5% of GDP. When you look at conventional non-climate finance investment, we know that trillions are being spent on carbon-intensive products and sectors, from fossil fuel energy to combustion engine light vehicles to new buildings that are still highly energy intensive. As you can see on this graph, the green is a mere fraction of the so-called dirty finance. So before getting into some of the details, I want to cover what exactly the landscape does track. So we track annual new primary finance flows into climate mitigation and adaptation interventions. We track financial commitments when an investment decision has been made, rather than the actual disbursement of the funds. And so the focus on primary transactions, ideally at the project level, rather than on secondary market activities, is to include investment into new productive assets or activities so we can really focus on the real economy changes. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, this doesn't include mergers and acquisitions or non-project bonds, because we can't actually trace that results in real economy change. We take a lot of care in our methodology that's been developed over the past decade, and we aim for a truly non-double counted number, which maximizes data granularity and adheres to a principle of conservativeness when reporting our numbers. This has a fairly significant effect on what we track. And so I'll also note that, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we don't include risk mitigation instruments such as guarantees or insurance in the total flows, even though these are crucial factors in increasing private investment. We also, as I mentioned, don't include secondary market transactions. And we also only include investments that we are confident are aligned with a net zero future, including in low carbon energy, such as wind and solar, electric vehicles, agriculture and land use changes, and hydrogen. And this means that we do not include investments in natural gas or nuclear, which aligns with the UNFCCC approach. Now I'll go through some of our more detailed findings. This is our Sankey diagram, which is probably our best known diagram from our report, and which shows a number of the different categories we cover. I'm going to go into some of this detail I'm going to go through some of these categories in more detail as well. So starting from the left-hand side of the screen, we track two different types of actors. One is public, which is in blue on the top, and then private, which is in orange on the bottom. And this also includes sub-actors like development finance institutions, governments, commercial institutions, corporations, and households. Next, we see how the flows from the different types of actors flow to different types of instruments used to raise finance, such as debt and equity, and grants and concessional capital. All of those financial flows are broken down in the type of use, which is mitigation, adaptation, and dual benefits. And dual benefits projects just target both mitigation and adaptation objectives. And then finally, over on the right-hand side of the screen, the Sankey concludes in the economic sectors, where the finance is actually being spent, such as on renewable energy, transport, and agriculture and land use. Now I'm going to go through some of our more in-depth findings. And I'll note again that there is far more detail available in the report than I'm going to review here, so I advise everyone to go take a look, and I'll drop a link in the chat as well. As you can see on this slide, the split between public and private actors has remained fairly even over the last 10 years, although overall public finance has grown more rapidly than private finance. In 2019 and 2020, public actors provided slightly more than half of all climate finance. This is led by development finance institutions, which are the bottom couple of dark bars, state-owned entities, which are especially prominent in East Asia and Pacific, and governments. Now, it's not shown on this graph, but the type of projects that public sources are financing is changing over time. For example, at the start of the 2010s, most national development finance went to renewable energy, but now a majority is going to low carbon and transport. Similarly, governments are starting to play more of a role in subsidizing the uptake of lower emission vehicles, as well as other low carbon transport like mass transit. Public finance can be catalytic. Roughly a third of overall finance is in the form of grants and low cost debt, which potentially crowds in private finance. Now, we can see the impact of public finance in the dramatic decrease over the last decade in the cost of renewable energy technologies. Some of you may be aware of this trend, but as you can see on this chart, the installation costs and the cost of energy for solar, onshore, and offshore wind have plummeted. Solar PV costs are down by about 80%, and wind costs by almost 45% relative to the start of the decade. So this means that every dollar that were invested at the end of the decade that we're tracking is resulting in more capacity than at the start of the decade. Now, government initiatives here have played a key role. By guaranteeing a price to investors or offering certificates that could then be resold to provide another income source for developers, the public sector found ways to incentivize the private sector to embrace the industry. And we're hopeful that similar trends will play out across other new technologies like electric vehicles, battery technology, and hydrogen. So moving away from public finance, private actors make up the other half of climate finance. This includes corporations, which represent utilities and project developers, and those types of institutions provide a plurality here, and those primarily invest in renewable energy. As you can see on this graph, though, the sort of second darkest color is commercial financial institutions, and those have made the biggest increase in growth since the mid-2010s. And specifically, banks are playing a more prominent role as intermediaries of sustainable and green debt instruments. As you can see on the graph, households make up the third largest share. Almost all of this is investment in electric vehicles, and we anticipate this will only continue to increase. Now, I should note that because of the way that we're tracking finance, we only track institutional investor finance if it's directly invested in a project. And that only makes up a couple % of the total. However, indirect investments from institutional investors into corporates, financial institutions, and funds are not represented in this analysis. So moving away from the type of actor to the use of finance, mitigation finance continues to dominate over adaptation. 90% of climate finance in 2019 and 2020 was in mitigation. That said, adaptation finance is increasing relatively rapidly at almost 16% a year, although it remains severely underfunded. There was actually, I think, a report just that came out today on the adaptation gap, which says that adaptation needs to reach a couple $100 billion by 2030. Now, I'll note that the concept of adaptation finance and the methodologies of its tracking are much less developed than for mitigation. So it's possible that we're not capturing everything here as we are in mitigation. As you can see, so this graph just shows where mitigation finance is going into what types of technologies over the last decade. And as you can see here, the top, the red squiggles remain dominated by renewable energy generation. 90% of renewable energy is for solar and wind power, so those are the largest sources of finance. As you can see here, the blue, the low carbon transport is expanding, and while it's not on this chart, we think that in 2021 we will see continued rapid growth in low carbon transport. Now, this includes electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, and mass transit. Now, I mentioned earlier that climate finance overall is nowhere near where it needs to be to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. This table breaks down those figures into different sectors. Now, the full list of the different sectors we're tracking is on the left, and moving left to right, we show 2019 and 2020 investment into different sectors, estimates the cost of Paris alignment through 2050, and then on the right-hand side, we have the % progress against the average scenario. Now, two things stand out to me about this table. First, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we are falling dramatically behind where we need to be in all sectors. This includes sectors where we've made a lot of dramatic progress, like renewable energy, but where we're only a quarter of the way to where we need to be, but also so-called harder to abate sectors like industry and agriculture, farming, and land use, where we're only at 3% of needs. Now, second, as we can see in the implementation cost section, the range of implementation costs varies dramatically depending on the scenario used. For example, as you can see in the first row, the lower bound is nearly half the cost of the upper bound, and that just depends on the assumptions used and the technologies and cost of those technologies. Now, moving on to instrument, similar to previous years, most climate finance in 2019 and 2020 was raised as debt, and most of that is market rate debt. Equity investments are the next largest category, and that's especially prominent in renewable energy. As you can see on this, concessional finance is only 16% of overall climate finance, and that's primarily being provided by national and bilateral development financial institutions and governments. And grant financing remains relatively scarce with only $30 billion in 2019 and 2020. Now, in terms of regions, this chart doesn't show it, but nearly half of tracked climate investments in 2019 and 2020 were in East Asia and Pacific, and that's primarily China, with another quarter going to Western Europe and North America combined. More than 75% of all climate investments flowed domestically, which shows the importance of national and local policies. As you can see on this chart, the level of domestic finance varies dramatically by region. In East Asia and Pacific, it's more than 90%, similar to US and Canada, which is driven by a lot of domestic finance and very strong domestic policies. But in places like sub-Saharan Africa, only 18% of their climate finance comes from domestic sources, which indicates the need for increased international flows from development finance institutions and multilateral development banks. So as I mentioned before, while a lot of money is being spent on climate finance, hundreds of billions of dollars every year, even more is being spent on fossil fuels. And as we've seen over the last few months, fossil fuel infrastructure continues to be expensive and volatile. And there are even studies suggesting that a rapid transition could actually save money relative to the status quo. So while we're seeing needs for trillions of dollars of investment, that could actually pay off in the short and long term. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about how our process has changed over the last decade. And we see two major developments that are affecting our numbers. First is that we've added new data almost every year to our database. When we first started, we only included private renewable energy and public finance from sources like the OECD or Bloomberg New Energy Finance. As we've continued, every year we've added a little bit more. And that's in part because those sources have been developed and we identified them, but also just the technologies were maturing and there was more money going into technologies like electric vehicles. So in the last few years, we've added electric vehicle information from the IEA, we've added infrastructure investments from IJ Global, climate bonds from Climate Bonds Initiative, and most recently, energy efficiency and green certified buildings. So on the bottom half of the screen, you can see that the other big change is that climate finance has also gained steam worldwide. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. Methodologies for tracking and classifying finance have been developed, and countries have been ratcheting up their nationally defined contribution ambitions. Obviously, it's not enough, but we have seen continued growth, which is exciting and a sign that we can go even further. And that said, even though we've seen growth and refined our approach, we do still have data gaps, and we're pretty upfront about that. So this chart just breaks down our coverage by type of institution providing the finance and the sector. As you can see by the green squares, we have pretty great coverage in energy systems and flows from the global north to the global south, which are primarily covered by the OECD and our surveys of development finance institutions and IDFC members. We have less clarity and coverage in sectors like industry and land use and adaptation, and flows between developing economies. This is due in part to a lack of consistency and sophistication in reporting from the private sector and public domestic budgets. It's also just due to a less mature sector that hasn't quite reached the numbers that we think are needed to improve the tracking. So to finish things off, I'm going to mention a few high-level recommendations we have for achieving that 20% year-on-year growth we need to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, and there's a little bit more detail on this in the report, but I'm just going to kind of quickly go through these. Now, first is going to be adopting holistic sectoral strategies. And that's especially the case for those sectors where it's not quite as obvious how we will achieve net zero, such as in industry and land use and adaptation. Second, we need to think about a new finance paradigm. Private investors need to look beyond short-term financial returns and use longer-term investment strategies and explore innovative financial mechanisms that can be deployed at scale. On the flip side, public financial institutions need to focus on how to mobilize additional private and public capital. And that's especially the case as government budgets are stressed by other needs. We see a need to really crowd in private capital to make this transition. A third, building on this, we need policies that will create enabling environments for that private finance mobilization. It's not just about putting money on the table. It's also about taking actions to reduce costs, providing financial and non-financial incentives, reducing risk, reducing fossil fuel support to make it clear where the transition is going, and then creating predictable environments that accelerate the net zero transition and allow for private finance to comfortably make investments. Finally, to finish things off, the public and private sectors should collaborate on common definitions and processes to make data available and usable. Groups ranging from regulators to TCFD and the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero to private companies should develop and consolidate a common set of methods and standards that help us understand the quantity of climate finance, as well as its expected impact and outcomes. So that's all I got. So I'm happy to take questions or hand it back over to you, Rob.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matthew. I really wish we were running so low on time because I do have a few really good questions here, but I'm going to pick out one. And this had to do with nuclear, and it's your thoughts specifically on the future of nuclear and climate finance with regard to the industry, given the new developments, especially around how France is positioning itself as a nuclear leader, with small modular reactors, as well as with regard to how safe nuclear is becoming. What are your thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, so it's a really good question and something we've gotten a lot of questions about, as we're thinking about next year's landscape and kind of what we're going to track. So, I think CPI's perspective is that, we just try to follow the UNFCCC's approach. We don't have any particular feeling about, the role, whether or not we, how much specific investment we need in nuclear, and, are comfortable following others in that. My specific feeling is it seems, it's becoming more clear, I guess, by the day that, we will need certainly the current nuclear reactors that we have. I live here in California where, we've had a lot of conversation around our final remaining nuclear plant and, whether we should keep that going. And there's certainly been sort of a groundswell of feeling that, yes, there are costs and yes, there are potential downsides and safety concerns, but also that it's a clear source of net zero electricity. And certainly, if we can invest in safer and lower cost options, then that's good. I won't say no. Certainly we saw in the European Union with their recently sustainable finance taxonomy that that they did include nuclear. That is that they've identified that is a source of sustainable, environmentally friendly investment. So that's kind of my feeling. I'm definitely not a nuclear expert. I don't want to pretend to know all the details of the new technologies and whether truly the modular reactors will be able to what role specifically they will play in a net zero future. But definitely some of the the scenarios that we identified, the net zero pathways, included nuclear. Some of them didn't include nuclear. So there's a lot of conversation there, and I think that's something that we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about as we work on next year's landscape.
Absolutely. Matthew, thank you so much for for coming today, and presenting. For anyone who has questions, thank you so much. We will hopefully be getting to you if we're lucky enough to have maybe Matthew come one of our daily briefings as well to present. I'm going to try strong arm him to try to do so. I know you're really busy though, but there's just so many good questions. Keep up the good questions, people. Kristen, thank you so much. And also Matthew, once again, thank you so much for that presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I know that I personally enjoyed it, learned quite a bit as well. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks all. And appreciate the work you're doing here.
Absolutely. Okay, our next speaker, right in from our own backyard, Tyler Carney. Tyler is a PhD candidate in the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences with a focus on natural resource policy and economics. His research primarily focuses on the economic valuation of ecosystem services, social dimensions of pollination, and collaboration in natural resource management. He is set to graduate in the spring of 2023. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is all yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Let's see. You'd think after a couple years of sharing screens that I would be proficient at this, but I wouldn't be surprised if I still make a slight mistake here.
Go for it.
So I just want to confirm you all can see the presentation.
That is correct. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. It's always that little awkward moment. You press that share screen button and then you show something totally different. But so hello everybody, and again, thank you, Rock, and thank you, Esteban. So I wanted to talk today mostly about ecological economics. And really this is sort of based on a lecture I give in some of my classes. This is also very inspired by lectures given by Dan O'Neill and John Erickson. This is not a field that I have pioneered by any stretch of the imagination. This is definitely, a field that's just been going on for a few decades, and I will gladly talk about the history of ecological economics in this presentation. But the point of this talk is that as we get into this whole idea of infinite growth, it's frankly impossible. We live in a finite system. So going off of Matthew's awesome presentation, I think we're going to start to see some similarities here between this idea of economic growth as we deal with climate change. Now, if there's a few takeaways I want you all to walk away from this presentation with, if there's anything else I really want you to remember, there's a few main points. So first and foremost, what exactly is ecological economics? Well, first and foremost, ecological economics aims to address that interdependence that we have and that coevolution that we have between human economies and ecosystems over time and space. That might be a lot of jargon, but we'll get into this. But if there's really one big point that might seem really intuitive and common sense, but you'd be surprised. But this idea of the economy being a subsystem of the ecosystem, therefore, without a healthy ecosystem, you cannot have a healthy economy. That can sometimes go over people's heads. You might be wondering, okay, again, that's pretty obvious. But when we talk about neoclassical economics and the extraction that we do, this tends to get lost in the picture, it seems. And with this whole field, there's a strong emphasis on natural capital and strong sustainability. So we are actually connecting economics with other social issues. We have to explore social justice within this context. We have to explore intergenerational equity, intragenerational equity, and the irreversibility of climate change and other environmental degradation issues. So if you've taken an economics class before, just like Economics 101, microeconomics, even if it was just in high school, you've probably seen this model before, the donut model, this cycle between households and firms. It is a very, very abstract and quite an oversimplification of how our economic systems work. Simply put, you have a constant exchange between households and firms, businesses. Naturally, businesses rely on households. They need labor. That is part of your factor for production. And through businesses and other firms, we get goods and services in return. Again, an abstract, very simple model. There's one big thing missing from this model, and that is the role of the natural world in this system. Because naturally, we have to extract raw materials from our environments. And we have to consider the waste products from our goods and services, the waste products and other externalities from this resource extraction. Where does all of that go? But this model here kind of makes that claim of this is an endless cycle. This will just keep happening. It can exist in perpetuity without any sort of real issue. Ecological economics says there's no way that's going to happen. So when we look at these two models side by side, we can see a pretty stark difference here. So if we think about this broad definition of economics in a general sense, the study of how society allocates scarce resources to alternative ends or uses, both of these big fields try to answer that same question, just different ways of doing so. Now with neoclassical on the right, we see this, the economy is this overarching sphere, this overarching model. And from there, humanity exists and the environment is a subsystem of our economic systems. We use the environment as a source of extraction, and it is a place where we deposit waste, whatever that might be. Ecological economics says, all right, look, we understand that in your Economics 101 textbook, that's one of the first pictures you see. We would kindly ask that you flip that model in the other direction. For the environment is the over-encompassing system here. The economy is a subsystem of the global ecosphere. That idea of without a healthy ecosystem, you cannot have a healthy economy. Humans need a healthy environment to survive. None of that matters. If we sit here and over pollute the planet, if we extract way more resources than we can or should perhaps, economic growth doesn't really matter if nobody's alive, right? It's a pretty simplistic view perhaps, and some would argue it's very intuitive. But when it comes to these models, neoclassical seems to fail at addressing some of these environmental issues. And perhaps this idea of, well, we can tackle environmental issues using the market. We just got to get the price of pollution right. We just have to incentivize. There are, of course, market solutions, and sure, we could have an extensive argument and debate and discussion on the merit of that. But ecological economics would argue that might be more reactive than proactive, and it's not doing enough in enough time. Because again, we're also trying to address social issues in this field. So let's expand a bit on that neoclassical model, that exchange between households and firms. So with ecological economics, there's two kind of really main schools of thought here, with the empty world versus full world mindset. And this kind of goes hand in hand with what's called a steady state economy, where you're not necessarily exceeding the capacity of a finite system, you are existing within that system. So we see here with the empty world, the economy does not take up that much space. Okay, great. The model is open with respect to solar energy. All functions of, well, I shouldn't say all functions, but as human life depends primarily on energy from the sun. From there, we can exist, we can extract resources, we can develop our societies and economies. However, there is still a finite boundary. The economy has to exist within that finite boundary. And as a result of all of our activities, we are putting heat out as a waste product. Again, it's still an oversimplification. We still have other waste products to consider, of course. But in this model, we are recycling as much matter as possible. So we are existing within this finite boundary, and most of our welfare as human beings come from ecosystem services, the benefits that we get from nature, to put it simply. In a full world mindset, the economy is taking up much more room, still within the finite boundaries of our ecosphere, but is definitely pushing those boundaries. So most of our welfare in this case comes from economic services because of just the sheer amount of space our economies are taking up. Now, the question on infinite growth is always present, but conceptually, can you have infinite growth in a finite system? Some might argue, well, okay, well, let's try and go past that finite barrier. Let's expand into the cosmos, perhaps. Let's mine asteroids. Let's colonize other planets, perhaps, and do resource extraction on these other bodies. So in some instances, some would argue infinite growth is possible, but when we talk about just our planet, we have one planet, we have one home, we have to abide by those finite boundaries. Outside of an economic context, if we think about infinite growth in a medical context, that is commonly a very bad thing, to put it very simply. So some would argue from an ethical standpoint, humans should not embrace this sort of infinite growth mindset, lest we be compared to perhaps the mentality of a cancer cell, for lack of a better word. So one of the main pillars of ecological economics is shifting away from quantitative goals to qualitative goals. So if you were to graph GDP over time, that doesn't always correlate with quality of life improvements. GDP is up, economic growth is up. What about quality of life? What about subjective happiness metrics in society? So there is a call to shift from perhaps using GDP as the sole metric for economic development and among other things, to perhaps uses such as the genuine progress indicator and other qualitative metrics. The big shift here focuses mostly on human well-being. There's a lot of talk of degrowth, sustainable development within this finite system. And if we were to put a word to it, shifting from quantitative to qualitative, we would shift, as say someone like Herman Daly, who's one of the main figureheads of ecological economics, would put, shifting from growth to development. So on that note, someone such as Herman Daly, there are three real main concerns with ecological economics that they're trying to address. And in this order specifically, we look at scale, which you could compare to the limits of economic development and economic growth. So we have to exist within the finite system of our planet. Then we have to look at distribution, the equity of these resources. Who gets the resources? When? How? Why? Those sorts of big questions. We then have to look at allocation, which is efficiency. So the limits is the first priority. We have only so many resources. Yes, there are renewable resources, but we also have to consider the amount of time it takes for those resources to renew, There are, of course, non-renewable resources as well. We have to consider human lifespan into this account. But when it comes to distribution, this is where that other social science, those social issues come into play. But first, we have to figure out how we can work within the finite system of our planet. So as far as the actual field, I'd be remiss if I didn't cover some degree of the history here. So the field itself officially is pretty new. The first meeting and the first formation of the International Society for Ecological Economics and the creation of the corresponding journal, Ecological Economics, only started in 1989. But if we think broadly speaking about the formation of this field, the stepping stones, the big milestones to the creation of this field, we have to look back even further. We could, and this is still a simplification, we could trace it all the way back to the formation of neoclassical economics. We could trace it back to our basic understandings of biology and chemistry and physics. But simply put, we can trace it back to the 1950s, when we start to really trying to think of this at the ecosystem level. Instead of just individual parts in nature, we think about this at the ecosystem level and tracing that flow of energy in ecosystems with Eugene and Howard Thiele. But then it takes a little bit of time before we start to really blend economics with ecology and how economics can exist as it relates to the laws of thermodynamics. So you have Nicholas George-Roegen with entropy in the economic process in the 70s. At the same time, we have these other figures such as Herman Daly looking at steady state economics, and Anne-Marie Jansen, and as well as the flow of this flow and this relationship between ecology and economic systems. So at the same time, you have all these different people working on roughly the same general concept, but it wasn't until '89 where they all came together and formed the society. And if we wanted to go even beyond this initial formation, if we look at 1997, this is kind of one of the first main pillars of when the fieldwork of ecosystem services really came to light. We talk about Robert Costanza's value of the global ecosystem services. That's a whole other can of worms we can really get into another time. So like I've mentioned, ecological economics, as the name would suggest, we're trying to bridge ecology and economics. So it's a very transdisciplinary approach. So we have to connect economics with numerous other fields. We have to connect economics with the natural sciences. We have to connect economics with other social sciences, keeping in mind this overarching definition of the study of how society allocates scarce resources to alternative ends or uses. So when we consider bridging ecology and economics, well, first, if we look at the natural sciences, when we think about that definition, if we focus on the scarce resources, this is exactly where we need to connect to our natural sciences. We have to understand how to abide by the laws of thermodynamics. We need to understand chemistry, physics, ecology. How do these ecological processes sort of support economies over time and space? How can we do these things sustainably? How do we value these sorts of ecosystems, perhaps? How can we operate in a way that doesn't destroy these ecosystems before the next generation comes along and needs to use these resources? On the flip side, though, we also have to consider it from another social science perspective. If we consider the alternative ends or uses, we align economics with ethics, philosophy, humanities. These big questions of intergenerational and intragenerational equity, we have to consider, well, who is going to get these resources? How? Why? When? All these big questions. And naturally, there are numerous critiques to this whole idea. There is extensive debate, even within the field and outside of the field, about assigning monetary value on public goods, these ecosystem services. And of course, the big question is, this is generally done using neoclassical methods. And I am a bit biased because this is where my research as a PhD candidate comes into play. Some would argue, well, if we assign a monetary value to the ecosystem services, it's a very anthropocentric approach. It's a very Western approach. And so some would argue, well, it's not really accurate. People don't really pay for public goods, and you're asking perhaps in certain methodologies, how much are they willing to pay to protect a certain good? They're not used to paying for it. This begets a big question on the ethics of monetary valuation of public goods. Is it perhaps overly simplistic? And some would argue, like Robert Costanza and myself included, some understanding of the value of these ecosystem services is better than none, at least within the current system that we exist within. Many entities, many agencies use benefit cost analyses. And if we ignore an economic value within our system, we might have very skewed benefit cost analyses. But it's not that simple either. Again, this field is not very old. So there's still a lot of multiple goals here, and many of them are unsubstitutable. So there's very complex problems. But this is also a strength, I would argue. It employs a transdisciplinary approach. We draw from all these different fields to try and answer these big questions. Ecological economists would argue that neoclassical has a very narrow view of the economy. It just focuses on growth and allocation, not necessarily where those resources come from. Many ecological economists would also argue that by just taking the argument, or the stance, that the market will solve all environmental problems isn't a proactive approach, and embraces what is called technocentric optimism. We will let the market figure it out. We don't need to worry about it. We will let the next technological advancement try and save us. We will figure it out. The market will get the price right, so forth, and we'll be fine. Ecological economists take a very big problem with that statement and that mentality. Because again, the overarching principle is we have to shift from growth to development. We must exist within the finite boundaries of our planet. Again, some would argue that's very intuitive. But if you're fixated on just growth, you're going to run into an issue. You cannot continue to infinitely grow within a finite system. It is simply impossible. So for anybody perhaps who is an undergrad or is getting really interested in these sorts of fields, like, if you want to pursue this further, I very much encourage you to do so. And it is growing a lot of traction in major curriculum. Numerous university departments offer courses in ecological economics. They might offer courses in environmental economics, which is different. But I'd also strongly recommend you reach out to graduate students or professors or scholars that study natural resource policy and economics. There is no way that they are in those fields and are not familiar with ecological economics. It is a centerpiece of that discipline. And above all else, I would suggest reading some of these seminal works from some of these people I've mentioned, such as Herman Daly, who, interestingly enough, passed away just under a week ago. Robert Costanza, who's still very much alive, as well as Gretchen Daly. But again, I also want to emphasize that it's a very transdisciplinary approach. You do not have to have an economics background to get involved in this field. We need scientists that are more in with the natural sciences. You need understanding of chemistry, physics, ecology. You need these social sciences. We need to look at environmental justice, sustainability, economic growth and development. All of these fields have to come together to facilitate this field's development as we move forward. And just some general references. I should have put my contact information on here. I do apologize, Rock and Esteban, for that. And I know I probably ran a little short on time, but that might get you guys a little bit back on schedule.
No worries at all. I really do appreciate, your presentation, Tyler. We do have a few really good questions, and I would strongly suggest emailing Tyler. Tyler, do you mind if I link your email in the chat or anything like that?
No, by all means. Like I said, I should have put it on here. I totally slipped my mind. By all means, put the question or put my email in the chat. Absolutely.
I really do appreciate it. Thank you. And I do see all your wonderful questions here. If we weren't running so low on time, we'd get to all of them. I would really like to. I don't see a bad question in the chat right now. Tyler, thank you so much for your presentation today. I think it was very informative. And at some point, we'll probably have to link up here on the UF campus, because I personally have a few questions I'd like to ask as well.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tyler. Okay, our next presenter today, Adam Cooper. Adam is a PhD candidate in atmospheric chemistry at UC San Diego and is an active climate organizer with the Sunrise Movement and UC Green New Deal Coalition. He's also the director of organizing for the University of California Graduate and Professional Student Council. Adam, welcome, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Super glad to be here.
As I understand it, you are also jet lagged, just like our folks in Egypt are right now, right?
Yes, yeah, I just got back from Korea and a climate activist exchange program, which is super fun. Don't have time to talk about it now, but I do have time to be jet lagged from, I think, the 14-hour time difference. So I've been very, very topsy-turvy the past few days. All right, so I'm here to talk about climate organizing in a higher education context. I think especially relevant at this conference with all of the academics here at varying stages, undergraduates, graduate students, professors, because these higher education institutions in which we are placed are still tied hand in hand with the fossil fuel industry, in many cases, even post divestment, with fossil fuel funding research, with burning fossil fuels for energy, with using the big banks funding climate chaos. These university campuses are our front line. They're where we spend the most time, and they're where we have the most ability to impact. Just to give a brief kind of summary of my climate journey, I first became kind of climate conscious and aware of these global issues as an undergraduate researcher with Chemists Without Borders, in which I realized just kind of the failings of governments around the world to address these pressing environmental and public health issues, and the necessity of these nonprofits to serve as band-aid solutions to some of these oppressive systematic issues that really deserve international governmental remediation. From there, I began my PhD at UC San Diego, where I'm an atmospheric chemist, also known as a scientist, and I study the transfer of pollution, kind of as shown here, from the world's rivers into the oceans, and how with every time waves break, you see these pollutants go up into the air. I primarily focus on petrochemical pollutions, such as microplastics, personal care products, and other pharmaceuticals, which are all made primarily from fossil fuels. And that's something I always like to include, is that I really think the crisis of plastic pollution is really the twin evil to the climate crisis. Deserves kind of equal and more attention. Because as we burn less fossil fuels, we're using more of them for materials and plastics, and that's really suffocating a lot of the environments that we're trying to save from the climate crisis. I was kind of activated to become an activist in 2019, along with many other folks as part of the global climate strikes. And I fell in with the Sunrise Movement in San Diego and the Sunrise Coalition in Sunrise, California, which really trained me up in the school of mobilization or momentum-based organizing, kind of marrying the schools of really slow community-based organizing, building up power in a community with the mass mobilization we need to create these really big theatrical protests, which can get more people into the movement and garner media attention to bring our struggle to the forefront of people's minds. And with that training, I then adapted that into my own front line at UC San Diego through Green New Deal at UCSD, which I spend most of the time coordinating our direct actions and advocacy approaches, kind of putting pressure on our administration from both ends, getting people in the streets, getting people to, confront power in person, as well as playing kind of the backdoor game and advocacy routes, meeting face-to-face with some of these decision makers. And so a lot of this context is coming after the wave of fossil fuel divestment, which I want to highlight. We had an earlier speaker, Dr. Mulkey, who's really instrumental in this, one of the early divestors at Unity College in 2012, which doesn't even show up on this plot compared to some of the following institutions using the efforts at Unity College as a model. And this is primarily concerned with universities divesting their endowment funds, their big pools of money, from investing in fossil fuel companies. So this started with efforts led by students in around 2011. And through the next couple of years, it's just risen exponentially. So Unity College really started the way in 2012. My university system, University of California, came in 2016. We finished our divestment in 2020. And very recently, kind of the turning point was in 2021, where you see this huge spike in the black line, which is the amount of dollars of money divested when you had giants like Harvard divest, which really led the way for most other universities to follow suit. Over 1,500 institutions, educational institutions, municipal governments, now having divested their funding to the tune of $40 trillion from the fossil fuel industry. A major blow against the fossil fuel industry in the fight for climate justice, but still just the first step. And following this, a lot of universities kind of were grappling with what comes next. This is really the rallying cry that had swept the first decade of climate activism on campus, and folks really weren't sure where to go from there. And so at UCSD, after 2016, 2018, things were pretty stagnant until we got caught up in the whirlwind event, kind of led by Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future for the 2019 global climate strike. And just about a dozen people, myself not included, organized a massive climate rally, going from not having an existing organization to turning out over 600 people, myself included. And I'm not sure if I can find myself in the crowd there, but getting these amount of people really springboarded efforts at UCSD to grow into this organization, Green New Deal at UCSD, which has led a lot of campaigns in the past couple of years, which I hope to detail during this talk. So our mission statement is that we campaign for concrete actions that UC San Diego and the UC system, the University of California system, must take to address the climate crisis and environmental injustice through a just transition to a fossil-free UC. And I think the really key word here is campaign. We're very projects-based, we're a very transactional win-based organization where we're not just like a climate change club, an affinity group. We go for winnable targets and we keep on fighting until we win. And I'm glad to share some of our successes and a few slides. Our theory of change is fundamentally bottom-up. It's amassing a climate consciousness on campus so that it's impossible for the fossil fuel industry to have the social license to operate, and it's impossible for the administration to ignore our demands and our feelings about how the university runs. This is a massive struggle against fossil capital and fossil energy, and against the decision makers, against the administration who maintain the status quo and wants to continue on with business as usual. We confront these interests locally. We confront these interests where we go to school, where we teach, where we work, because that's where we're most effective. We understand the terrain. We understand these really complicated bureaucratic structures, and our local efforts can amplify outwards. And we've seen our wins at UCSD spread through the University of California system and spread to universities worldwide. In California, we're very full of ourselves, and one of the statements is, as California goes, so does the country, so does the world. But that's true anywhere. It was true at Unity College with the divestment movement, and I hope it's true at universities kind of across the world, taking climate action and confronting the fossil fuel industry where we're most effective on our campuses. And we have a variety of tactics to come at this issue. So let me see if I can pull up a laser pointer. There we go. So we do this kind of in the traditional route and the inside game, showing up to regents meetings and places where our presidents and chancellors host public comment sessions and flood the airwaves. We've been at every public comment section for the past 2 years, talking about our demands. We do this through formal avenues such as the University of California Academic Senate, in which we got, I think 95% of voting faculty to vote in favor of decarbonizing the UC, going to 5% of current emission levels by 2035. And of course, we do this through big flashy protests. We do this through banner drops in front of a very famous library, saying UCSD burns fracked methane. We do this through theatrical performances, such as our Halloween events down here. We do this by graffitiing in university-approved locations and trying to garner attention. We've made documentaries of our own. We try to get news coverage. And then about twice a year during the September school strikes and during Earth Day, we have really large, massive rallies that kind of shut down the campus as we call attention to these issues. And in addition to that, we also have kind of the more traditional student organizational approaches, hosting documentary screenings, panel discussions, both on our efforts and hosting academics to give lectures kind of aligned with our efforts. We have 4 main campaign goals that I want to go through. And I think these are good examples for universities wanting to get into climate action in a post-divestment or in parallel to divestment movements. They're first to teach all students about the climate crisis and climate justice. The second one is around fossil-free energy, getting the University of California, which is largely powered by burning fracked methane gas on campus, because of the shift towards renewable energy. The third is fossil-free finance, so cutting financial ties with the fossil fuel industry and banking, insurance, and all remaining investments, because the tricky thing is once you've divested, there's always another pool of money that's not actually divested. And so a lot of efforts go into tracking down some of these hidden pools of money that universities like to tuck away. And the fourth is coalition building and supporting general student well-being and workers' rights. Because if we want people to show up for us, we need to show up for other people, and we need to build a strong coalition of support across all interest groups on campus. So first, we teach the climate crisis because we need more organizers. We need a kind of Vietnam War protest level of student engagement in social issues on college campuses. We can't be content with limiting climate action and climate education just inside the classroom. We need to make more folks who are going to be inspired to take action, learning the right things, not just learning about CO2, but learning about social movements on campus. We do this through formal teaching with faculty hosting lectures outside of their classrooms or giving guest lectures in different courses. And we do this through a campaign to implement a climate justice university general education requirement. We also do this informally, teaching peer-to-peer through deep canvassing. We're out on a library walk, tabling every week, and doing more fundamental relational organizing, talking to our friends about this, making this a community that cares, and really growing our power among the student base so that everyone on campus knows a Green New Deal organizer, so that when we do have an action, when we need to take over campus, we have the network to go out and get those students where we need them to be. The next campaign is fossil energy, which I spent a lot of my time on. University of California has a gas problem. I heard University of Florida also has a gas problem, and I think they're building a new fracked methane power plant, which is going to last for decades into the future, emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. And the bulk of university carbon emissions really does come from energy generation. Research takes a lot of energy. My climate research takes a lot of energy. And if we don't procure these electrons, this electricity well from renewable sources, that leads to massive carbon footprints. The University of California, San Diego is about 3% of the city of San Diego's carbon emissions. For places like the University of Florida, rougher numbers, I was Googling that earlier today, but I think it's 20% of Gainesville's carbon emissions come from the university. It's an absolutely massive amount because we're such an energy dense industry as higher education. But the transition is possible. Places of comparable size to UC San Diego have implemented measures to make renewable energy projects. This is oftentimes through the formation and purchasing of renewable energy credits, through building new solar farm projects. So we've seen places like Stanford and Arizona State rapidly reduce their climate emissions shortly after committing to getting off of the gas and shutting down their on-campus methane power plants in favor of purchasing electricity and integrating into the grid. Next campaign is fossil-free finance, because divestment and endowments are just one slice of the pie. There's also divesting other areas such as pension funds. There's also breaking up with the big banks and insurers that are kind of tied hand in hand with the fossil fuel industry, as well as shifting student and faculty behavior. And so a lot of what we do is that deep organizing, relational organizing with students, person by person, getting them to switch from large extractive, destructive banks into local credit unions on campus. And finally, there's coalition building. We've really built up a protest infrastructure on campus, And so in other affinity groups and other issue areas, such as protesters for reproductive rights access, people standing up for Black lives, Indigenous lives, post protests on campus, we want to turn out with our people power, we want to turn out with our infrastructure and make sure that people have the ability to have really successful, really safe protests and ways to express themselves on campus. We build political power. We have, 40,000 students. That's a massive voting block that never really votes. And so we endorse candidates. We get out the vote for people who will serve as Green New Deal champions in higher elected office. And we also stand in coalition with student workers. For example, the union I'm in, which is my background, UAW, Student Researchers United, is currently preparing for the largest strike in academic history, 48,000 workers strong across the state of California. And one of our main demands at the bargaining table is centered around transit and climate justice, not just providing free public transit, but actually paying people the same amount that they would have paid in parking to take public transit to campus. So for me, that's like $5 cash in my pocket every time I take the trolley to campus instead of taking my own personal car, which will shift behavior. I only take the trolley maybe half of the time. I would take it all the time if I got paid to do it. And will lead to real emissions reductions from our university's commuting, which is usually the next biggest pot of emissions after energy systems. And when we fight, we win, and we've shown a lot of success in all these various campaigns. Our pressure around teaching got the university to agree to a climate justice gen ed for 30,000 undergraduates, not just climate science, but climate justice. And we're still kind of working through what that looks like, but that should be coming in the next year or so. On fossil-free energy, we've really shifted the discussion in the UC system from a pledge towards carbon neutrality, relying on purchasing millions of dollars of carbon offsets while still burning fossil fuels, to an actual commitment to a fossil-free UC. And they're even using our language, they're using our talking points. We see it coming out of our president's mouth at meetings, which is amazing, along with actual monies to make those electrification plans, because it's a complicated process. And so we're able to get $12 million from the California budget this year to create actionable plans to shut down all of the power plants on UC campuses. On fossil-free finance, one of our weekly protest targets was the Chase Bank location on campus, and we chased them out. They're gone. They left over winter break last year, and now we have a new credit union, and that is kind of the face of finance at our university and our student center now. We've also shifted business relationships from using Chase as a preferred partner to using the credit union as a preferred partner. Although we're still going after like the big banking, which is a little bit trickier to shift across the whole University of California system. And on well-being, I just keep on getting excited about this because we just had a vote with 75% turnout, 98% voting yes. But we're going to mobilize student climate activists to the picket lines when we have a strike in about 2 weeks. Just use the raised climate consciousness on campus to really support workers standing up for themselves and changing how higher education treats their workers, which I'm just over the moon for. And to win, we used people power. We had to get a lot of folks involved. We did this through mobilizing, we did this through organizing. On the left are just some pictures from a UC-wide Earth Day, where we had simultaneous rallies on all 9 UC campuses. That's never really been done before. It's never been done before for climate. And we did it last year. Really expanding our power just from our one campus to across the whole university system. And we did this through really deep organizing and a lot of Zoom rooms and a lot of meetings and a lot of emails through many of our teams from these campaigns, splitting out into different teams. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a tremendous amount of organizing and a tremendous amount of people putting in really good, all volunteer, all unpaid work towards fixing our university system. I want to expand real quick before I finish this presentation, just kind of beyond the UC on what I see as some of the more successful campaigns and coalitions forming around climate justice and higher education. So I want to give a super huge shout out to fossil-free research, which is really led by students at like Cambridge, Stanford, Harvard, George Washington University, who are also seeing themselves kind of in this post-divestment landscape. And I think instead of going from a like everything in the kitchen table approach, they really narrowed down on one area that we've honestly been neglecting in the UC system, although we're starting to form teams around this, which is the fossil fuel industry corrupting research funding and creating these massive centers which just like pump out greenwashing and bad science and bad policy white papers, kind of extending the social license of the fossil fuel industry to operate in higher education. And this is really a recent campaign forming in the end of 2021 through the summer of 2022. And we'll be having our first kind of international day of action in about 2 weeks, also coinciding with the strikes. So definitely look out for more coverage on this group. And I think they've been receiving a lot of good press coverage in general. And this focuses around a letter. And so all the climate scientists here, I asked you to go look this up. There's still time to sign on to it. Over 750 climate scientists from over 130 institutions calling on university leadership to reject research funding from the fossil fuel industry and implement a ban on this corrupting source of funding. And next, I'm going to go into the end game, and this is really led by university students in Portugal who created End Fossil Occupy, another coalition calling for complete shutdown of higher education campuses and business as usual until demands are met to divest and divorce university relationships from the fossil fuel industry. And so this covers kind of all of the campaigns I've talked about previously, the fossil fuel research campaign, just completely separating the fossil fuel industry from higher education. And these are the folks so far who have signed up to take action within this like fall semester. University of Penn students got a lot of press coverage last week when they stormed their homecoming football game and shut that down. And currently there's 3 occupations, 2 in Spain, 1 in Italy, where people are camping out on university campuses, going into halls of administration and not leaving until they fully divest from the fossil fuel industry, ban research funding, and commit to a zero energy future. Just some tips and tricks we've kind of collectively amassed in an organization over the years that we'd like to leave off these presentations with is first, push from all angles. You need people meeting with leadership, with administration. You need people yelling at them outside their houses, and you need everything in between. You need people talking with other students, other faculty. You need teachers. You need people who care. You need people who just focus on bringing communities together. Make the most of your existing relationships and avenues. Everyone has a professor they're taking a class with. Everyone has an advisor. Everyone has students. Use those existing avenues. Use the networks we have, because that's how we're most effective. In general, be seen. We don't want to be, armchair activists or Twitter activists, although I guess that is a form of being seen. We want to get outside. We want to be on the streets. We want people who aren't in our spheres of influence. We want people outside of our political bubbles to see what we're about and to be able to have onboarding ramps into the movement. None of this works if we don't like each other, and leftist infighting is like the worst thing for movements in general. So build strong, lasting friendships with fellow activists, come together to build art, come together to hang out, come together and say you're not going to talk about climate change. That's the most radical ask, but that can lead to some of the strongest coalitions and some of the strongest organizations. And then obviously consider what you have the capacity to do. In higher education, we're here to learn, we're here to teach, we're here to do research. All of this is unpaid labor that the university should be doing, the university isn't doing, so we're going to be doing for them. So think big, aim high. We will build a better academia together, but don't burn yourself out and make sure that you're taking care of yourself along the way. So I'll leave you with that. I have my handle, Green New Deal's handle. Please follow me, Twitter, Instagram, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Adam, you were absolutely wonderful. I was personally blown away. At some point we have to reconnect, you know, since I think it was since April, since the LLAD. I do have a number of questions here. We'll be very specific about which ones we picked out because we're running so low on time. But the first one, I think, and maybe one of the most impactful is this one. Was there a specific moment in time where you looked at the situation around you and said, I must get involved? Was there any particular time where you said that in your mind and you just went forward with it?
Yeah, I think that was during the 2019 global climate strikes. We had a massive amount of people, mostly young folks in high school, organizing this big rally downtown San Diego. And I asked all my friends, all my colleagues, you know, I'm at a climate research center. I thought, wow, this is like the target audience to come out and like show support to these like young high school activists. Absolutely no one showed up. It was just me and like one DEI coordinator. And none of the other researchers, none of the academics wanted to get out of their damn labs and actually do something in the streets. And that's when I realized that we had a massive gap in academia, a massive gap in climate research and atmospheric chemistry research, where these people aren't confronting the structures of power that are causing all of these environmental issues that we're studying and that we're trying to better understand so we can fix and get rid of. And so, like many things in academia, at first I was driven mostly by spite and trying to be a better academic than those around me. And since then, it's really shifted into a community that cares, my friends, my colleagues, my comrades, and that's what motivated me to keep going. But I think that turning point for me was just honestly getting really pissed off about the situation and saying like, if I wasn't going to stand up, no one was at that moment. You're muted, Rock. You're still muted.
You're still muted.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. I was going to say, we have a number of really good questions in the chat here. Unfortunately, we are running super low on time. So I just said, everybody you see Adam's information that was on a slide, take that information down. Please follow up with him. He's a wonderful, wonderful fellow. I really do enjoy speaking with him when I do. So Adam, thank you so much for showing up today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you all. Keep up the good work, everyone.
No, we're learning from you, my friend. Okay, our next speaker today is Esteban Rodofili from here at the University of Florida and also a member of Campus Climate Corps. Esteban's an international PhD candidate at the School of Natural Resources and Environment at UF with a concentration in fisheries and aquatic sciences. He is advised by Dr. Vincent LaCour. His dissertation is centered on the development of automated detection methods to survey marine animals in satellite and drone images. Esteban studied in biology at the University of Buenos Aires and did a master in public policy at the Torquato di Thiele University before coming to UF for his PhD. He also served as chief bargainer for UF Graduate Assistants United, and he is a national member of AEL. Esteban, the room is yours.
Thanks, Rock. Can everyone hear me well?
Doing good, yeah.
Great. As Tyler said, one would think I'm already acquainted with these processes, but let's see how well I share a screen, right? So can you all see that?
Yes, you can see it now.
Am I sharing? Am I in presenter mode? Yes.
Yes.
Is everyone seeing my notes? Just to check. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see
sorry.
all the notes.
You can see my notes. Okay, sorry. That wasn't intended. Let's go through this mode. Sorry about that. Really quick, we don't have much time, but essentially, I'm part of the team that is covering COI and COP27 here in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. What you see here, and you're already familiar with this, is the location of Sharm el Sheikh, and COP27 will be carried out in the International Convention Center. The objective of this brief presentation is just to put you abreast of what we know will happen in COP27 in view of the agenda established. But of course, this is anticipating ourselves a little bit. Will be my first COP, so I'll try not to draw too many conclusions from whatever clues we already have. And this content will be covered in the following days. So the first thing we have is that Egypt, essentially the presidency of the country that hosts, has essentially the power to establish up to some point the agenda, and this is essentially the calendar of the COP27 meeting. Days, I'll try not to go over what Rock already explained, but days 6, 7, and 8 are essentially meetings of high-ranking officials and diplomats. Many negotiations happen behind closed doors. Some events can only be covered by press, for example. The Egyptian government, just recently, we were notified of this, I believe yesterday or the day before, has moved what we call the pavilions, and we talked about that initially in this transmission. The pavilions that countries, NGOs, and big advocacy groups have now to start on November 8th, which most likely was up to a point unexpected and difficult for planning and logistics. So the Egyptian presidency has laid out the plan of thematic days with several presentations on different topics, and this will happen between November 9th and 17th. So the first day is Finance Day. What we and again, without anticipating ourselves too much, after all, this conference has not started yet. Definitely, the fact that Finance Day is first sets a tone, and essentially, it's the coverage of topics here is about alternatives to finance emission cutting and more sustainable practice, and it goes from actual investments to philanthropy. There is an emphasis on Africa, and this is something that we will see throughout COP27, and the need to finance, especially the global South, in order to achieve development while cutting emissions. November 10th is the day science doesn't get its own day, essentially, and perhaps that says something. But essentially, within the agenda of Science Day, there is, of course, a revision of the IPCC report, systematizing and combining research around the world. That's a topic that appears frequently, and that I personally consider rather urgent. We produce a lot of science around the world, but to actually crystallize this into global policies, a good amount of systematization is necessary. There is coverage of zoonosis and the health effects of climate change in general. There is again an emphasis on Africa. in particular about technology transfer, and as it pertains very detailed topics. There is an emphasis on coral reefs and other marine habitats and dust. At the same time, we have the Youth and Future Generations Day, and this focuses on intergenerational dialogues on mitigation, resilience, adaptation, on the young-led action against climate change. There is again a focus on Africa, and Yango, the branch, the UN branch that encapsulates all the organizations led by young, by the youth, and it ends with a press conference. The next day will be Decarbonization Day, and fortunately it does get its own day. It focuses on particular industries. There is a focus on cutting emissions in steel and cement industries. There's a rather positive view on the progress made by the oil and gas industry. At least that's what this agenda allows us to see. There is also touching on the decarbonization in the fertilizers industry, the methane pledge to cut emissions by 33% by 2030, and some emphasis on low carbon development for Africa. So our next day, it's the day of adaptation and agriculture. So the focus here is on adaptation technologies for the worst effects of climate change on food production. The plan for Africa in the context of a continent that already suffers from food insecurity. This is overall a program that is also connected with nutrition. There is some emphasis on the private sector as well. Perhaps there is more emphasis on this day or the emission reduction day on carbon. Perhaps we could have expected some more emphasis on this day or in the emission reduction day on carbon sequestration through crops. That could have been desirable. But we will have to see in detail through our coverage what we find on November 12th. The next day is Gender Day and Water Day. They are combined. So Gender Day emphasizes women-led projects from policies to science to finance, the African women realities in the context of climate change and their livelihoods in the context of a transition to decarbonization. We haven't had a huge emphasis on other gender diversity in the context of climate action, and in what pertains Water Day, we have a lot of emphasis on early warnings and adaptation. We have emphasis on managing river basin system, considering also that floods have become one of the worst and more frequent disaster caused by the climate crisis. There is emphasis on water security, which is also pertaining the African continent, and a special topic on climate adaptation in Africa, while closing with impacts and solutions for sea level rise. You may have noticed that in November 13 there is nothing programmed, but in reality what happens is that it's a rest day. So probably there will be some closed doors activity, but it's not included in the topics agenda. Energy Day is combined with Civil Society Day. This is November 15th, and essentially Energy Day focuses on affordable energy transition in Africa, clean energy in the context of global crisis and in the context of energy security. This is something we've seen as of last month manifested in Europe itself. There is some attention to the technological aspect for solutions and quite a focus on green hydrogen policies, green hydrogen economy, financing the energy transition again, and the interplay in scales between national and global policies. In the ACE and Civil Society, they will have some focus on the advocating effort by civil society, from the climate disasters to food and food security and other climate topics. Again, we get to go to the next thematic day. This is Biodiversity Day. What we are seeing, well, this is probably my own bias. It is a relatively succinct set of topics, two of which are a subject commented before, the connection of climate and biodiversity. There is some focus on conservation and land management success stories, but the positive aspect is that is probably the session and scale of actions by policymakers following up with the former COP in Glasgow. Our next thematic day and the last one is the Solutions Day. Perhaps we could have had the whole half of the conference about solutions content, or we could have had it intertwined with the problems analysis, especially given the urgency manifested by the last IPCC report. There is some considerable emphasis on green entrepreneurship and solutions by the private sector, although perhaps the public sector, which is essentially the space of our collective efforts, might have merited more time. There is some attention put on greening national budgets and investment plans, sustainable transportation, waste management solutions, and housing and urban policies. But inevitably from this agenda, we see that many other fields of solutions could be left out of this COP27 unless they are intertwined with the content of the other day's topics. Just without spoiling, please stay tuned to our next transmissions. They will be focused on our coverage of COY. We have already a set of interviews with UK farmers, shifting to practices to limit fertilizer use and to protect soils. There are interviews with other campus-based initiatives on climate change advocacy, and with Africa youth-led community projects. And with that, I give I give the lead back to Rock. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esteban. Hopefully that was very educational and insightful for everyone watching about what's going on currently over at COP. So with that, we're coming towards the end of our presentation today. Really do hope that everyone has enjoyed all the programming, the content. I've certainly really enjoyed, trying to get everything together so that everyone understands that if you want to participate in COP, no matter where you are, if you are a student, if you are a faculty member, if you are, anyone in the university system or not, we're here on the front lines trying to make that happen for you. So I'll just leave off, as I always do on our last, on this slide. I think it's probably the one that's most powerful. And I'll say to each and every one of you attending today, remember this slide pertains to each and every one of you, and you're the one who's going to decide where this lies. You may not think that you have a voice at COP, but that's not the case. Campus Climate Corps is going to be there on the ground. We're going to be talking to folks, getting the interviews necessary. We're going to be making sure that your voice is as amplified as we can possibly make it. Even if the voice is small, it's going to be there. So everyone, please stay tuned for the next 14 days as we cover the Conference of Parties 27. Thank you everyone for attending today. Really hope everyone enjoyed the content and the presentations, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you everyone.